Hello everyone, welcome on into another stream. The last one before Armored Core 6 gets released. Or wait, no. Maybe Armored Core comes out later in the day. I need to double check. So anyway, nice to see all of you again. Necropolis, Astanex, Scowleezy, Jube, welcome on in. So, 3 seconds early. Yesterday we watched the first, well, technically the second half of Smoughtown's Great Ones lore video. And then we watched another video by Dang It Jim talking about Margit the Fell Omen as a kind of boss in response to a video by Joseph Anderson. And we also followed that video up with one by Ratatosker in defense of Margit. So there's a pretty good variety of videos there. I'm thinking I might look into perhaps talking about those kinds of videos that are more about game design as we continue to stream and stuff, just because it's kind of fascinating and not everything has to be lore, or even if it is all related to lore, the lore of game design perhaps. So yeah, a little bit of a difference in pace, but not crazy. So today we're going to go back into some more Bloodborne lore. I only have one video queued up for us today, essentially just because of how long I've been reacting to things at this point. So I'm a little bit curious to see if I'm going to take the full time today, or if it's just going to be pretty straightforward for the most part. And then if it is straightforward, we'll figure out what we'll watch after that, depending on how much time we have left. So hope you guys are all ready, and let's go ahead and dive on into Bloodborne lore, the Pthumerians and the Labyrinth by Smoughtown. Hey Che, welcome into the stream. Should you finish your Miro or move on to better things? Finish your Miro board. I have no idea what it's about, but yeah, if you do finish it, let me share it with the chat or something. Oh yeah, and that actually kind of reminds me, even though we don't have a ton of people in the stream right now because it's still kind of early, I've thought about potentially reacting to some of our community essays that have been introduced to the Discord from time to time. So if you guys want me to share anything you've written and have me respond to it directly, I was thinking about potentially doing that in the future. Except you'd have to hear my lovely reading voice get all the inflections on things wrong as I stumble my way through these sentences. I should? Okay. Yeah, so if you do have a Miro board or anything like that, I would be interested in looking at it if you'd be so inclined to share. And anybody else, really. Alright, so let's go into Smoughtown's video with Bloodborne lore, the Pthumerians and the Labyrinth.
To those dust. Everything in the surface world of Bloodborne can be traced
and let me
back
know how
to
the volume is for you guys,
which lie beneath the surface, the winding labyrinth known to some as the Tomb of the Gods. Indeed, it is within these hallowed corridors that the story truly begins, with the Great Ones, with the Pthumerians, and with the Bergenworth scholars who pierced its dusty innards, hoping to uncover the truth of their world's greatest mysteries. This intriguing and mysterious maze is home to numerous civilizations, but most fascinating of all are the haunting Pthumerians, servants of the gods, bound by blood pact, a race almost as alien to humanity as the Great Ones themselves. This is the story of a civilization growing from humble origins to regal monarchy, before collapsing into primitive warbands represented by the Watchers, pale shadows of their royal Pthumerian ancestors. And now within the empty corridors of the labyrinth, we just get glimpses of the greatness that was once the Pthumerian kingdom. For me, my great love for Bloodborne is so deeply tied to those dusty walls and winding corridors, and so I ask you to join me this week as we dive into the heart of the labyrinth and of Bloodborne itself. But before we get started, I want to acknowledge some creators whose work has been very...
So before going into that, yeah, I really do like a lot of the stuff that's within the Chalice Dungeon, with the big caveat that it does get kind of old pretty quickly. And I guess you could say that's a pun. But for as much content is in the Chalice Dungeons, the so-called lore of them is very sparse and spread out. And I just do think there are way too many story Chalice Dungeons to get to the end to fight the Pthumerian Blood Bride. So, right. This, I'm sure, is going to be a fun video. Like, I do have some decent thoughts about the Chalice dungeons in general, but typically I don't really dive too deeply into stuff that doesn't have a ton of text about them, other than like looking at obviously more of the visual design and extrapolating from that.
Very influential on this video, and that is Bob the Hollow and Last Protagonist. And as always, I'm going to give a shout out to Loki, author of Abyssal Archive, for their insights and translations that I will reference throughout. And before we get started, guys, remember that if you like Bloodborne lore, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel.
Yeah, I think I've seen the one video from Bob the Hollow on Dark Souls lore, so I should probably delve into their Bloodborne stuff sometime too, huh? And if you guys have suggestions, let me know.
This video was originally going to be about all three distinct cultures within the Labyrinth, Ys, Lauren and Pthumeru. However, as you can no doubt see by the size of this video, the Pthumerians alone warranted their own video, and I will eventually cover Loran and Ys in another video. But before we start looking at the Pthumerian culture, I think it behooves us to look at the nature and structure of the Labyrinth itself. The first thing to note is that while we experience the Labyrinth through the nebulous Chalice dungeons, it is a real physical place that exists below Yharnam itself, and we learn of this via Alfred, who says the following.
And the tomb of the gods, carved out below Yharnam, should be familiar to every hunter.
We discussed this in my choir lore video, but it seems like the Labyrinth was essentially discovered at Byrgenwerth. In Loki's lore article on Byrgenwerth,
Alright, Scowleezy said, behooves us, Smo is ex-military confirmed. Okay, at least I wasn't the only one triggered by that, but I was going to be quiet until you brought it up. No, I don't think it's probably as like a culturally relevant over there, but who knows, maybe I'm wrong.
he points out the fact that Byrgenwerth is Germanic for worth of the burial place, which is obviously relevant when we consider the Labyrinth is also called Tomb of the Gods. And Loki believes that Byrgenwerth is established where it is because of the graves that we find in the area surrounding the Forbidden Forest, including some found right outside Byrgenwerth where we fight the Shadows of Yharnam. There are a lot of hints that these graves are connected to the Labyrinth itself, and a point well made by Charred Thermos, who has unfortunately now deleted their channel, is that the Labyrinth is referred to as a Tomb of the Gods by Alfred, suggesting that it is a burial ground for gods.
Yeah, and that is also incidentally confirmed in the Bloodborne official artwork book, I believe, in that when it does show like these pictures of them, I'm trying to remember, it actually might say like Tomb of the Old Lords, or maybe it says Tomb of the Gods, or maybe like it's one of the two, but yeah, I don't exactly remember where the term comes up from, but I don't disagree with it. And for anybody who is hearing about it for the first time, it is true that Charred Thermos has recently deleted their channel, so sorry to be the bearer of bad news there. Killer King says, the labyrinths below Yharnam are real, but whatever we explore through the chalices definitely don't seem so, if for no other reason than the bosses, with there being Ram, Abritus, the pre-retcon Lawrence, and Queen Yharnam. Yeah, they're kind of a complicated subject to talk about because of the kind of repeated bosses there with Ram and Abritus specifically. So a lot of people like to think that they're snapshots in time. I don't necessarily have super strong feelings about it. They could be like an alternate dimension, a kind of pocket dimension. There are differing ways of explaining them, and for what it's worth, it might be the equivalent of how you could canonically go into another hunter's world and help them in jolly cooperation. So maybe they're another world's Ram or Abritus, that and like all of these worlds are just kind of incidentally connected somehow. But of course, that is like speculation, and they very well could be pockets of the past, so to speak, or just nightmares in general, and maybe they're conjured up by the denizens within them. Do we know why Charred Thermos deleted their channel? So they did make a post on Reddit in reply to somebody else, in that they covered essentially what they wanted to cover. They felt that YouTube was kind of a drag for them in terms of like like socially, I guess, or like personally. They may have had other stuff going on in their life. And most importantly, it wasn't really fun for them anymore. So they decided to step away. I do think it's unfortunate that they went the nuclear route of deleting their channel rather than just like literally stepping away. But I do respect their wishes. And so I won't cover any more stuff by Charred Thermos. Charred Thermos did actually contact me back after somebody had messaged them on Reddit, and that they said that it's okay that I leave my reaction to his Lawrence video up. So I won't be taking that one down because we got the go-ahead from the man himself. Crow's taking off. Welcome back. Who is pre-retcon Lawrence? So if you consider the bloodletting beast as the quote-unquote founder beast, or like the host of the beast blood as far as like his Japanese is concerned, there are arguments that the bloodletting beast could have been Lawrence in the past, and that the skull in the Grand Cathedral could be like the current version of Lawrence, but way back when he may have transformed down there in the chalices. Obviously, they retconned it, which is why who was it that said it? Killer King called him pre-retcon Lawrence. The Chalice Dungeons have to be either an alternate dimension or in the distant past. Queen Yarnum being pregnant with Murgo is proof enough of that. I would disagree, and I guess I might as well pull up the footage. Give me one moment. During the fight with Queen Yarnum herself, she can actually summon a couple of projections of herself, and none of the projections are actually pregnant the same way that she is. Like, they lack the baby bump. So, killed trio. This should be probably good enough. So let's go ahead and zoom ahead. Good old PlayStation 4 capture. Alright, so these are her clones. I was trying to zoom in, and it's a little bit difficult to tell, but they don't have quite the same baby bump as the original, and that's how you can tell which one is real and which one is fake. Oh, this is a really good angle. So these fake ones don't have the baby bump, and they will get deleted in 1 or 2 hits, so this one is the real one. And here I was fishing for the visceral. Alright, so hopefully that's good enough. Okay, yeah, you can definitely see the baby bump at times with her. Okay, there, that's a better angle. So, the version of Queen Yarnum that appears in the Moonside Lake, as well as Murgo's Loft, could actually just be one of her projections, and we don't really know if that's supposed to be her physical form. Ah, yes, hit the pregnant one. Exactly. His waking world, Lawrence's waking world beast skull also looks more monkey-like, and the founder beast loses its head in one of the versions. And yeah, that's why some people thought, if the headless bloodletting beast lost its head, could that help explain why there's this random skull of a head that kind of looks simian-like in the Grand Cathedral? So, it was a very, very popular theory, obviously more so before the DLCs came out. What's Murgo doing in the Nightmare of Mensis if the Yarnum we see in the main game is a projection and the real one is still pregnant? So, to be fair, it is technically ambiguous as to whose child Murgo is. Like I've said before in previous streams, it may have been planned at one point in development for Murgo to be the child of Annalise, the Queen of the Vilebloods, and Yarnum and the Wet Nurse and the Moon Presence could just all be incidentally beckoned towards Murgo's cries because it's an infant. So, another thing worth considering is if Murgo is Yarnum's child, and after we defeat Yarnum, we get the Yarnum Stone, which says that it has the Queen's consciousness within it. What does that actually mean of Murgo? Is Murgo simultaneously the Queen and also simultaneously kidnapped by Murgo's Wet Nurse? These are, I think, some of the questions that get a little bit overlooked if we just make the first assumption that Murgo is the Queen's child, which I totally understand why. Alright, So going back to Smo's video.
Thus the presence of these massive graves as the sort of outer or upper level of the labyrinth makes a lot of sense. This becomes even more apparent when you consider the visual evidence as well, as we see slugs, most likely pearl slugs, writhing on the surface of some of these graves, suggesting they have slipped out from the labyrinth. And aside from these interesting observations, common sense would dictate that a school founded to study the labyrinth, Byrgenwerth, would be situated close to the subject of said study. Indeed, one of Willem's attendants, Dorez, further hammers home the idea that the entrance to the labyrinth is found among these graves, in the forbidden forest surrounding Byrgenwerth. Dorez is the prior owner of the Graveguard attire, one of the coolest outfits in the game incidentally. Now, the appearance of the outfit kind of speaks for itself.
Alright, so I just wanted to pull up the kind of slug reference that Smo was making since he didn't have visuals which complemented what was on screen, or like what he said rather. So if you zoom in on one of the gigantic graves, like on their backsides, you can see these kind of worm-like things coming out of them, and they very obviously resemble the pearl slugs which he said. So let's make this a little bit bigger. Although I'm sure you guys get the idea now. Yeah, so those look pretty close, but again, like, not exact. I mean, it's arguable, but I think it's a fairly straightforward claim. And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I've always thought that the hooded mask kind of looks like Giant Dad from DS1, the pinwheel mask.
It's clearly modelled after a Pthumerian itself, heavily implying that Doris, in their duties as a graveguard, came into contact with Pthumerians. This is more or less confirmed by the graveguard mask item description, which reads the following. Mask of Doris, graveguard of the Forbidden Woods. His pale countenance mimics the Labyrinth Watchers. Willem kept 2 loyal servants back at Byrgenwerth. When they were sent into the labyrinth, they encountered the Eldritch Truth and went mad. One became the password gatekeeper, while Doris became a graveguard of the forest. So this gives us a lot of information. Firstly, it does tell us that Doris and Willem's other servant was indeed sent into the labyrinth, once again reinforcing the idea that the labyrinth is located around these graves, or at least around Byrgenwerth. Secondly, it mentions Watchers, and while the Watchers are something separate from the Pthumerians, I do believe, as I will explain, that they are descendants of the Pthumerians after the civilization collapsed, and I do think this is quite clear given their visual identity is very close in nature to those Pthumerians. But yes, long story short, the entrance to the labyrinth, I believe, is around these graves in the forest, and in Loki's Byrgenwerth article they even point out a hatch on the lowest floor of the Byrgenwerth school itself, suggesting that this too could be an entrance into the labyrinth that students and Willem used whenever they needed to do a field trip. And I go over all of this information just to reinforce the idea that the labyrinth is a real physical place in the waking world of Bloodborne, it's just that we don't experience it that way. Now, before we go any further and dive into the labyrinth ourselves, it is time for us to fuel up with today's sponsor. Today's video is...
Alright, so I agree with that in general, that it does seem most likely that the physical locations of the dungeons would be based potentially around Byrgenwerth. There might also be a case to be made that you can find a location to the dungeons beneath the Grand Cathedral where you fight Abritus, or also in Canehurst where you have like a bunch of the Bloodsuckers, because the Bloodsuckers or Bloodlickers can show up randomly in the dungeons. So beyond that, Canehurst also has statues or statuettes that exist in the Chalice dungeons throughout like its dining hall and stuff. So there is probably a more direct connection between Tomru and the Chalice dungeons and Canehurst in general. And then there's something else I was going to say. Yeah, so I don't know if he's going to go into this later, and it's not like super important, but there is a kind of interesting discrepancy in the Graveguard set that I may as well talk about now. I've talked about it a couple times on my different streams here, but for the Gravekeeper mask, where it says that, I should enlarge this. Where it says, Willem kept 2 loyal servants back at Bergenworth. When they were sent into the labyrinth, they encountered the Eldritch Truth and went mad. The Japanese is a little bit more ambiguous, and it could be read in the sense that 2 servants who worked for Willem of Bergenworth were accompanying their lord when they encountered the arcane or the Eldritch Truth in the labyrinth, and then they lost their minds. So, Aruki Mania chose a different route to go with that, and he says that the 2 servants went there by Willem's orders, but in his translation notes, he does second what I say, in that Shtagao and Mieru can be read as like Mamieru, which could mean that they were following Willem and they came face to face with the Eldritch Truth or the Arcane, or they encountered it essentially. So, why do I bring that up? Because if Dorez and the Great Gatekeeper were literally following Willem, that could imply that Willem was down in the Chalice Dungeons himself, doing his kinds of explorations, and what they encountered is a mystery, but I do think there is a good chance that... I should probably pull this back up. I do think there's a good chance that what they encountered was the voice of Abritus, the daughter of the cosmos, because... Let's go pull this up. The Eye Rune says that... Oh man, I forget. It's a transcription of I as spoken by Left Behind Great Ones. Unfortunately, the way that it's written in English is due to the fact that singular and plural are not often made explicit in Japanese. So the localizers had to go with something, and it makes sense that if they didn't have the context that the Left Behind Great One was a specific Great One, that they would assume that it was multiple Great Ones. So anyway, in certain other descriptions, like the Augur of Abritus and the Pearl Slug especially, it's a little bit clearer that the Left Behind Great Ones is a reference to Abritus herself. So my argument here is that the Eye Rune came from the voice of Abritus herself, and she could have inflicted that rune into Willem's head because he has it when we meet him in Bergenworth. He suddenly gets, he becomes obsessive over getting eyes on the inside, and we don't really know why that is. I've theorized, so this is headcanon, that the reason he became fixated on eyes is because he has this arcane voice reverberating around his head saying, eyes, or anything like that. So that could have potentially made him lose his mind, even if he didn't rely on blood in general. Oh man. So, now that I say that, I guess I should also address the issue with the Rune Workshop tool. Man, I hate having to do this so often. Where it says in English that Provost Willem would have been proud of Carol's runes as they do not rely upon blood in any measure. So that makes it sound like Willem should not have known of Carol runes, which is kind of contradicted by virtue of him having one. But setting that aside, the Japanese is different in that it says that not relying upon blood is something that is close to Headmaster Willem's ideals. So it's not as though he didn't know about Carol runes, it's that they were closer to his idea of insight, I guess, or just superhuman knowledge in transcendental planes of thought. So, now that I've said all that, as I mentioned in my true story of Bloodborne explained, in earlier parts of development, Abritus was called Kos, and so it might have been very, very early on that when Mikolash was praying for Kos to grant them eyes on the inside, that he could have meant Abritus, because Abritus may have given Willem and or Ram the Eye Rune and caused them to both kind of transform. And Willem may have wanted something, Mikolash may have wanted something similar and gotten his information confused, or by the time we talk to him, his brain is already fried, or maybe he just didn't know the difference between Abritus and Kos. And I do think it would have been really, really funny if Mikolash is trying to outmaneuver the choir and they already have access to the Great One that he wants, and so he just kind of screws up, and the choir is already screwed up, so it's just kind of funnier to me that way. So, with all that being said, they could have cut all of that stuff for a reason, and Cause could, like the mother Cause, could still be the one that Mick Lash is intended to pray to in the retail build of the game. So, sorry for all of those detours to just talk about something that's not even directly related to what Smoughtown is talking about, but it's pretty interesting to me. The Rain Transformed remembers the Chalice Dungeons ruining their first experience of Bloodborne. He refused to beat the Wet Nurse or start the DLC until after beating every story Chalice, so you're overleveled. Yeah, that's what happened to me, but for what it's worth, when I did fight Gehrman and the Moon Presence, I had put a ridiculous amount of pressure on myself, thinking that oh, the only way you could get a good ending in this game is if you beat the last boss without dying. I don't know why I thought that. It just kind of made sense to me. So I made sure I killed Gehrman, and when I was fighting the Moon Presence, which I didn't know about, I didn't die, and I had 0 blood vials left. So it was one hell of a hard-fought battle, and it was very, it was still satisfying the first time I beat Bloodborne that way, even though I was definitely way overleveled for the Wet Nurse fight. You remember the Chalice Dungeons? Low-key, oh yeah, I read that one. None of the endgame main bosses or any of the DLC ones left much of an impression on you, and they were so easy. I feel like the DLC ones were really difficult, but when I did do the DLC my first time, I was on New Game Plus, so they were a little bit scaled up. Don't get you started on Carol runes. Carol! Scalazy thinks some of the dungeons are beneath Yharnam, with the rest extending into extra-dimensional space, or it's all in the real world, and maybe the rituals are used to teleport to specific parts. I think it's probably a little bit of both, that there may have been real dungeons initially, and then the Pthumerians may have, came into contact with the cosmos, aka the nightmares, and then started, building a moon base in the dreams, essentially. Hey, Jack Roach, nice to see you again. You did the entire Chalice Dungeon grind this weekend? Oh, man. You actually kind of liked it? Doing the Defiled Dungeons was really challenging? Yeah. How did you find Defiled Amy, Amygdala? I know that one is quite a number of people's run-enders. Too bad the game immediately ends after the Moon Presence. Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about Chalice's not scaling with Cycle. Obviously, towards the end, it gets a bit rough, but it would be maybe a little bit nice if you had the option of, I guess you could always do harder Chalices. Never mind. Anyway, let's go back into our HelloFresh sponsor.
It's brought to you by HelloFresh, who are once again feeding the lore, and I couldn't be more delighted, as it is a product I personally use in my day-to-day life. As someone who is glued to their PC almost 100% of the time, HelloFresh has thankfully been keeping me well fed and off the takeaways, by delivering pre-portioned ingredients and simple to prepare recipes right to my door. One of my personal favourites is this hot and crispy chicken burger with sriracha mayo and sesame chips. Really a step up from the meals I used to eat as an executioner in Anor Londo. Perhaps now Gwen will let me
Ew, grinded bone dust.
become a knight. But for those who want to spend as little time as possible in the kitchen, HelloFresh has fast and fresh recipes that can be ready in as little as 15 minutes. But the thing I love about HelloFresh the most is the sheer variety of recipes, with 40 plus every week, meaning there's plenty to choose from, no matter your dietary requirements or personal taste. And best of all, the ingredients are fresh and tasty, with the journey from farm to your fridge being under 7 days. So use my link or go to hellofresh.com and use the code POGSMOOG50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Thanks again to HelloFresh for sponsoring the lore, and now back to the Pthumerians. Bob the Hollow has an excellent video on the Pthumerians and the Labyrinth, and I will link Bob's original video below. Firstly, Bob points out something I had overlooked, in that it is actually the Pthumerians who carved out the Labyrinth originally, not Ys or Lauren but Pthumeru. As the lore Pthumeru Chalice reads, The old labyrinth was carved out by the Pthumerians, superhuman beings that are said to have unlocked the wisdom of the Eldritch Truth. I would suggest that the Pthumerian civilization is therefore the oldest of all labyrinthian civilizations. Bob then correctly
Yeah, I would agree with that on a base level.
identifies that while we can visualize Pthumeru Ihil as one of the lowest and probably most central points of the labyrinth, something reflected in this super handy labyrinth diagram that Loki provided to me, parts of the labyrinth like the Hintertomb are the parts that extend outwards rather than deeper, the peripheral edges of the labyrinth as a whole. Hence they are called Hintertombs, meaning outlying tombs. And we know from the Hintertomb Chalice description that they are continued to be expanded outwards by the Watchers. And
Correct.
we'll talk about the Watchers and their relation to Pthumerian culture in the last part of this video. But I just wanted to give you some idea of the probable structure of this labyrinth, with the centre of the Pthumerian kingdom likely being the most central and deepest part of the labyrinth, but the Hintertombs and outer Pthumerian layers being the levels that the Byrgenwerth scholars most likely first entered by. And so when it comes to Ys and Lauren, given that they are connected to the labyrinth which we have just established must have been carved out by the Pthumerians in the first instance, we could possibly speculate that these are either contemporary civilizations to the Pthumerians or offshoots who developed their own culture and identity over time. I think the latter is quite likely given the actual corridors found even within these parts of the labyrinth share the same symbology found in the Pthumerian labyrinth. There are just some cosmetic differences, with different enemy types that represent each culture's different way of trying to connect to the cosmos and the Great Ones. But let me know your thoughts on the actual...
Yeah, so that was something I didn't realize for a long time, that the different chalices had different enemies that appeared with them. I mean, obviously that's obvious to an extent. However, to give a more concrete example would be that the Pthumerian chalices themselves, like the main branch, don't really have beast-type enemies except for a couple of bosses. I believe there's the beast-possessed soul, and arguably like the watchdog of the Old Lords in like the first chalice, and then the bloodletting beast. And I think that's pretty much it off the top of my head. And the Loran chalices do have like the beast patients as well as scourge beasts. And there are no beast patients or scourge beasts in like the central Pthumeru chalices as well. So it's something that kind of struck me as being interesting and made me really reconsider like where the plague of beasts originated from, if Pthumerians seem kind of resistant to beasthood, if that makes sense. How is Lauren related to Pthumeru? We don't really know. I tend to believe that Lauren or Loran may have been a kind of satellite to the Pthumerian civilization. So if Cainhurst represents Pthumeru, then Loran may have represented like old Yarnum or something, where like they were just more commoners or like lowly folk who weren't as tolerant of the blood for one reason or another.
Actual structure of the labyrinth in the comments below. One final specific about the labyrinth we need to discuss before moving on to the early history of the Pthumerians is the Chalice Dungeons, a subject we have touched on before in my Great Ones video, but we will do so again here for the sake of completeness. I believe that the Chalice Dungeons are pocket dimensions or dreams that reflect a segment of the labyrinth as a specific instance or moment in time. In my choir video, I highlighted the fact that every time we open the Ys Chalice Dungeon, we fight Ebrietas, despite the fact that Ebrietas now exists in the waking world in the orphanage. Even if we have killed Ebrietas in the waking world, we are able to use this chalice and face them again, and should we cancel the Chalice Dungeon and redo the ritual, we can face Ebrietas for another time, showing that every time you use this chalice, it is just a singular pocket or moment in time that is being recreated.
So obviously I think that's a very good way to try to reconcile what I would consider to be more of a gameplay mechanic. And I don't know if canonically you are able to visit the exact same chalice site or whatnot with the same ritual. I mean, obviously you literally can, but I just don't know, like, if that's actual lore or if it's just gameplay mechanics.
No matter how many times you do the ritual. Indeed, Bob made an amazing observation which I had never noticed before, and I feel so silly for missing it. This observation is that the Yharnam we meet in the Nightmare of Mensis, the current consciousness of Queen Yharnam, is postnatal, as we can see from her figure and the very fact that Murgo now exists and she is here weeping for her lost child. And yet the Queen Yharnam we face...
And again, I'm not entirely convinced that Murgo is her child, because I think it creates a lot of problems with reconciling the Yharnam stone having the Queen's consciousness in it. And if the Yharnam stone has her consciousness in it, what does that mean that Murgo is separated from her if they have the same consciousness? So at the very least, if you want to make that claim, I think it's pretty fair to say that Queen Yharnam is probably a great one of some variety, but that's not like the most important thing. The other thing that I was going to say about that, I think I already covered earlier. Oh yeah, just the whole astral projection thing in the fight. So this could potentially be a projection of Queen Yharnam instead of like the real version.
In the Chalice dungeons is still pregnant, as again we can see this from her figure, and I'd actually never noticed this before. And so once again this reinforces the fact that the Chalice dungeons and the Chalice rituals are just creating a pocket dimension that reflects a certain instance of time. And in the case of Pthumeru Ehil...
So another thing that's worth considering is the baby's cries are shared between the Murgo Wetner's fight and the Queen Yharnam, so that could be more evidence that like Murgo is her child. But I just wanted to point out that when she does do the arcane grab attack, it comes from like getting in close range to her and the baby crying. So it's not actually Yharnam who's like binding the players, it's the baby and its cries, which is a really cool level of detail. And also I just really like the kind of fusion of sound effects to go along with boss attacks that is a little bit more indirect than most cues in like these kind of action arcade style games. Is the Japanese more direct that her horrific consciousness is inside the Yharnam stone, or is it a case similar to the Fosefka chord, which talk about Willem out of nowhere? I'm pretty sure even in the English it's direct. Let's go ahead and pull up the Yharnam stone. I guess it is technically vague now that I think about it. Well, yeah. So, a sacred heirloom left by Yharnam to Pthumerian Queen. The Queen lies dead, but her horrific consciousness is only asleep and stirs in unsettling motions. So I guess, yeah, you could make the extrapolation that the Queen isn't necessarily connected to the stone itself. I just don't think that's the most intuitive reading of it. And the Japanese is similarly vague on that front. However, I do think we should connect the idea of it being a holy relic left behind of Yharnam as being relevant to this sentence, but it isn't that direct, perhaps. So that was a good question. Hey, Pony Boy. Prepping your D&D character for Baldur's Gate or an actual group, and welcome back in. Okay. We will go back to the video. Let's put this back over here.
It is recreating the moment when Queen Yharnam was still pregnant. With the nature and physicality of the labyrinth somewhat outlined, let us now explore the origins of the Pthumerian civilization. I think one of the best places to start when discussing the Pthumerian people is probably with the Pthumeru Ehil Chalice, which reads the following. Pthumeru Ehil was the title of both the Pthumerian monarch and its capital. This reveals that while early Pthumerians were mere humble guardians of the slumbering Great Ones, their descendants felt entitled to name themselves a leader. So this has a lot of interesting starting points for us, as we begin to unpack the story of this great civilization. What this chalice is saying is pretty straightforward but really interesting. It is saying that while later Pthumerians had a monarchy and were their own nation essentially, those that came before them, their ancestors, were only humble guardians. They had no nation of their own, or even any leadership, they just existed to serve the Great Ones. And if we combine this with the lore found in the Lore Pthumeru Chalice, then the implication is that the Pthumerians carved out the labyrinth firstly for the Great Ones, not for their own nation, and that it was only later converted as the location of their civilization. And so right at the onset, I think it paints the picture of a society, of a people, that has a close, intimate relationship with the Great Ones. The very origins of these people is rooted in that connection. This is where I think it's worth looking at the actual design of the Pthumerians, and it is so distinctive and it really conveys a certain feeling to the player because it's done so well. And so let's try and unpack it, because it goes a long way in selling the otherness of the Pthumerians despite them being humanesque in appearance. Where the beasts of Yharnam give us a sort of werewolf aspect to the gothic horror, the Pthumerians and the Vilebloods provide the vampiric aspect to it. But specifically their faces are of course a reference to the famous painting by Edvard Munch called The Scream. And much like the Pthumerians themselves, the visual design of this painting gives off very powerful feelings. The painting of course means different things to different people, but in general it shows a human emitting a primal scream. To me it speaks of existential horror, facing some truth or realization that triggers almost animalistic despair.
So these characters may have been inspired by The Scream. I don't necessarily know if that's true. I have another thought about what I believe inspires the look of the Pthumerians, but I don't know if Smoughtown's going to go over it, so I'll just kind of reserve it for now and hear more of what he has to say.
That existential fear or angst is best described from the words of the artist himself, who described the events that led up to him painting this incredible piece. The following quote comes from his diary in 1892. "I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun went down. I felt a gust of melancholy. Suddenly the sky turned a bloody red. I stopped, leaning against the railing, tired to death, as the flaming skies hung like blood and sword over the blue-black fjord and the city. My friends went on. I stood there trembling with anxiety, and I felt a vast infinite scream through nature." I think what Munch describes here of someone being so overcome with what they have witnessed and felt that you almost cannot bear it is very similar to the depictions in Bloodborne of people who are exposed to the eldritch truth. Indeed, even Munch's description here of him feeling a vast infinite scream through nature really does make me think of a human in the world of Bloodborne realizing the true nature of the cosmos, the eldritch truth. Thus, to me, I believe the appearance is partly meant to convey this constant exposure to the eldritch truth, a kind of permanent expression of shock that permeates their entire people. Bear in mind that this is the expression and face that Dorez, the Grave Guard, takes as his own mask after experiencing the eldritch truth himself. However, I also think there is another facet that has contributed to their ghoulish appearance, and this is blood dregs, or corrupted blood, known in the game as vile blood. This is a material that I suggest is central to their blood pacts, their marriages to the Great One, a tradition carried on by the vile bloods of Cainhurst, but we will talk about that later. But much like blood ministration affects the people of Yharnam to the point where they turn into beasts, I believe that the Pthumerians' attempts at using blood dregs to make the perfect host, the perfect surrogate for the Great Ones, has contributed to their ghoulish and vampiric appearance. If we once again look...
Yeah, I agree with that, and I'm sure he'll probably go into more detail about it later, and probably reference a bit of my work, because he did mention me earlier in the video, and I think Mortis told me about it a little bit, but yeah. Before going back into the stream, I wanted to welcome in Nectarine and Mercy. I don't remember if you said anything earlier. Yeah, so welcome to the stream. Nice to see you guys. And Killer King says, a new Tarnished Archaeology video dropped. Yeah, we actually discussed it a little bit in the Discord earlier today. I don't know if I'm going to watch it on stream, but I don't know. We'll figure it out. Rain Transformed says, It's a shame that the Ease and Lorne chalices are depth 4 and depth 5 only. They're much more visually interesting than Central Timur and Hintertomb, but are barely in the game. I have mixed feelings just because I feel like there's too many chalices already, at least the story ones. But I definitely feel you could probably have reduced some of the earlier Pthumerian ones and probably eased up a little bit of the difficulty for the later ones. Hey, Eric Williams, nice to see you again.
Look at the lower Pthumeru chalice, we can see that the Pthumerians are referred to as superhuman. By its very definition, a superhuman are beings that are beyond human, and in the case of the Pthumerians, whether this is a result of their nature, or if it's due to their close relationship with the Great Ones, or if it's to do with their experimentation with blood dregs as we've just discussed.
Man, I just really love the visual design of the Elders. Just like their weapon is so freaking cool. They just seem like real badasses. And I'm jealous that we don't get a trick weapon of anything quite this magnitude.
I will leave it up to you to decide. Before we move on, it is worth noting that Loki offers a different, more straightforward explanation as to why the Pthumerians appear the way they do. Simply that it's a result of them living underground for generations. To quote Loki now, prolonged shade from the sun turned these humans inhuman, with deathly pale skin and sunken black eyes.
I get where he's coming from with that, and I think that is technically sort of canon in some of the side materials that came out with the games website that is now defunct. I should double check that, but anyway, I do have other thoughts that go into it, so maybe Smoughtown will continue with them here.
Whatever is a contributing factor, we can see that they do possess certain superhuman elements to them. When we face true Pthumerians like the Pthumerian Elder or Queen Yharnam, we can see that they possess certain superhuman abilities. For example, both Yharnam and the Pthumerian Elder are able to teleport at will. The Pthumerian Elder is able to summon weapons almost at will, seemingly. And Queen Yharnam's abilities go far beyond even this, being able to project different copies of her that can actually attack and harm enemies if they need to. I would say in Yharnam's case it is most likely that the cause of her powers is her corrupted blood, the build-up of blood dregs, as a lot of her abilities have to do with manipulating blood, forming them into spears for example. But the fact that even her spraying her blood on us actually does damage to us really does hammer home that her blood is vile and that it is the source of her power. However, as we discussed earlier, the blood monarchy of the Pthumerians is not something that came about until later on, and before that they were just superhuman beings that were humble guardians, and thus some of their superhuman elements must be intrinsic to their race. But let me know in the comments below what you believe is the source of their superhuman nature. But in what way were the early Pthumerians guardians of the Great Ones?
Okay, yeah, I did find it. I'm pretty sure... I don't think I have the English version. Wait, this one isn't it? Yeah, I don't think I have the English... Oh man, did I just close it? Okay. Yeah, I don't think I have the English version of the website saved. I'm sure, I should probably look up Meph's wiki. Who should probably have it, because I know she'd archived the stuff that I sent her from here. So this talks about, the Merciless Watchers. And the last paragraph here, it talks about how they're born underground, that's where they live, and, they grow because of, dead flesh and and blood. And so, because they're never touched by sunlight, their skin has become pallid. So, yeah, Loki might be right a little bit to an extent, but I do think there is actually a little bit more that goes along with that, because the Pthumerian dudes in Cathedral Ward are still all pallid and they're up above ground, and I would also argue that Queen Annalise of Canehurst has a similar kind of affliction going on that we can't really see, at least in terms of her having more silvery kind of skin. But I also think that's another historical reference that we could talk about perhaps a bit later if that comes back up. So, sorry to get off track there. How much of the Bloodborne comic do I consider canon? None of it. Absolutely none. I think it's just more or less officially endorsed headcanon, and it has nothing to do with the games. Survivorship bias. The only Pthumerians we see are the crazy high level ones with powers. Like the little dudes, wouldn't say that they have like powers, but the little regular guys are gonna be in the game. Yeah. What's going on with the scythe that the dude in the upper cathedral ward is wielding? The art in the comics is really good. So was there actually footage of that? And I was just like looking for the other thing. So in upper cathedral ward, if you see like the blue fire on the scythe, that isn't limited to the upper cathedral ward. And if you have above 15 insight and go to the normal cathedral ward, the little church servants will have the blue, black, fiery flames on their scythes. And the ones that have the lanterns will have a bunch of eyes on the lanterns. And then the others with the hunter rune style crucifixes will have a red aura around them. So Pthumerians always reminded you of a skinny version of the traditional gray alien. That's where we get the Ayla mouse from. The celestial emissary. It's not really, though. The sickle Pthumerian descendant is the most closely related to a normal confirmed Pthumerian. He has no actual powers other than being fast and strong. Yeah, that's kind of how I look at it, too, that if we think of a monarchy, it's very natural for the queen or king, the monarch, to rule over everybody. And then next in line to the throne are the monarch's, essential family members, the nobility. So they're going to get the next highest amount of riches in the forms of like blood dregs and superhuman powers. And then it just kind of slowly gets disseminated down through the entire Pthumerian civilization, and what I like to call literal trickle-down economics, where the queen disseminates her blood to the nobles, and it gets trickled down to the descendants, and from them trickled down to the watchers, and then the little like minor dudes all throughout the dungeons.
This brings me back to the original purpose of the labyrinth, something I alluded to earlier. Later it would become a kingdom, but it started out as a labyrinth that was carved by the Pthumerians in service of the Great Ones, taking the Pthumeru Ehil and Lower Pthumeru Chalice together. Let's talk briefly about the semantics of the word Pthumeru itself, and what it could even mean. Thanks to Loki, we do have some idea, and I quote Loki now. Pthumeru, or Tumor, is an obvious portmanteau of the English tomb and the ancient civilization of Sumer, so essentially the tomb civilization, which makes sense given this is a civilization born out of tombs that they carved for their gods. Also, consider the design of the labyrinth itself. Alfred refers to it as the Tomb of the Gods, and indeed the interior of the labyrinth does remind me of a tomb, or catacombs, or the interior of the pyramids, for example. For me, this does reinforce that the labyrinth was a tomb first, a civilization second. Does the term Tomb of the Gods literally mean that the gods, or the Great Ones, were actually buried in here? Well, that is actually a complex question, but again, it is one we will attempt to unlock. A fascinating scene awaits us in the Altar of Despair in Upper Cathedral Ward. We find Ibratas staring sadly towards the corpse of a being that very much resembles Rom. And yet we later face Rom, and we know that the Rom we actually do fight is not a vision or a dream, as this Rom is having an effect on the waking world, by hiding the ritual of Mensis. The explanation as to how this is possible, why there is a corpse of Rom, and yet we face Rom, is again something we looked at in more detail in my Great Ones lore video. But in short, item descriptions like the Great One's wisdom and the umbilical cord that talks about Willem suggests that the main difference between the Great Ones and a regular human is the elevated nature of their mind, that they have the ability to think and operate on multiple planes of existence, on higher planes, essentially having the level of mind that can operate within these dreams, within the cosmos.
Yeah, I don't know if I would agree with that to an extent, in that the brain of Mensis is described as a great one. However, it's also said that its brain tissue has essentially just been rotten due to the effect of the evil eyes, which I imagine would have an effect on its thoughts. But even with that being said, it does certainly have a very high level of kind of psionic attacks, or perhaps psionic communication that comes across with like its gaze affecting the hunter. So there is a kernel of truth to it, but it's not quite the same style of thought or rationality that we would associate with like humans and stuff. So if it operates on a different plane, it is truly alien to the human mind, with the example of the brain of Mensis, as well as Rom being the vacuous idiot spider, and I think furthermore with the moon presence itself snarling like a beast as it leaps around the hunter's dream in the fight with it.
And we can see that this is quite well illustrated with the case of Ibertas, who is referred to in the choir set as the left behind Great One. And my assumption has always been that Ibertas's kin have ascended to these higher realms without her, leaving only her behind, and that in general it is normative for Great Ones to ascend beyond the physical. The very fact that these higher realms are referred to as dreams or nightmares should tell you the exact nature of these higher dimensions. They are realms of pure consciousness, much as dreams are in the real world. And that is why the more advanced Great Ones like Urden and Wet Nurse to some extent exist without a physical form. To be a higher life form in this universe is to leave the physical behind, to become more mind than matter, to leave behind your crude frame of flesh and bone and exist in a state of pure thought that we cannot fully comprehend as a human. In the case of Rom, it seems that when one attains such ascendance, they can transcend their mortal form and transform their consciousness into the dream. Now, there may be no set way of doing this, as we cannot tell how beings like Urden actually came about. Perhaps their mortal form just became pure consciousness and ceased to exist entirely. Despite this, we do find another similar example to Rom, of a being who literally leaves their mortal body behind when they ascend to a higher dream dimension. And I am of course referring to Mikolash, host of the Nightmare of Mensis. We find Mikolash's corpse in Yarhar Ghul, and yet we still encounter his consciousness, fully realised in the nightmare, albeit he's gone a bit mad, no doubt as a result of him forcing this encounter, as normally what Mikolash has achieved would usually be reserved for the Great Ones. But I would likewise assume that Rom's fate is in a similar situation, where she hasn't necessarily been killed, rather her mind has ascended to the higher planes, and as a result her body has been left behind and has died. And if that is the case, no wonder Ibertas is sad here. It's just another reminder that she is a left behind Great One.
So to tie along with that, there is a little bit of a difference in Mikolash's death quote when you kill him in the Nightmare of Mensis, where he says, "Oh no, I'm waking up, I'll forget everything." The Japanese actually poses it as a question, and it could be a bit of a rhetorical question, we don't exactly know. However, I do think it's interesting that if it is posed as a question, it shows Mikolash's ignorance as to the state of his physical body while he's in the dream. Odin is formless in our dimension. He may exist somewhere outside it. Like to a 2D world, he'd be formless until we stuck our hand in it or something. So the way that I look at Odin is that he's formless in the sense of like water or fluid being formless, in that it doesn't have a fixed form, but it will just match the form of whatever container it's in. So you could say that like a person, like the form of blood changes from person to person because like the shape of every body is slightly different. So that could be like one way of explaining how Odin is formless. And with him being said to exist in blood and voice only, there could be the possibility that his formlessness is a product of him like being like a bunch of wavelengths or something like that. He could just be like a Carol rune, essentially. We don't really know. A Carol rune that gets like amplified through blood or like blood loss? I don't know. This does make the Abritus situation even more confusing. Left behind where? By whom? So I think Smoughtown might be trying to get at Abritus is left behind because her mind can't exist on the metaphysical plane, which is kind of hard to reconcile because of the way that we could potentially find her in the Chalice dungeons, perhaps. But to be fair, in Smo's opinion, it's more of a representation of the past than the present, so that could still kind of work for him, I suppose. Both Eileen and Jur remember the Hunter's dream after no longer being the Moon Sentient Hunters. Yes, that's true. So, yeah, we don't know if they finished the hunt. I'm pretty sure Eileen would have, but I don't know about Jura. I do think it's possible he, quit. It does say he renounced his vows, but even if he quit, he may have quit, after all of the damage was done. And then I thought I was going to mention something else in relation to Abritus, but I forgot.
Long tangent to be sure, and I do apologise, but we now have a greater understanding of maybe why this labyrinth was called a Tomb of the Gods. While we don't know if there is a uniform way in which Great Ones can ascend, we do at least have the examples of Rom and Miklash.
Oh yeah, no, somebody had said that Astyanax said her corpse could have been brought there as you were killing the one reborn. So maybe you were talking about something else, but that could have been a potential way how, the choir or, Abritus could have gotten summoned. It could have just been, been brought into the waking world by accident. We don't really know, especially with Miklash believing that they could summon Kos. And, yeah, I don't know. Just, Abritus is a little bit of a mystery. And I guess if Abritus is left behind, does that mean that the celestial emissaries are also left behind because they're kin? I don't know.
To show us that in some cases a body is left behind when the consciousness ascends. Thus these tombs could be named as such because this is where the Great One's physical forms would go to their final rest. And it is these corpses that were buried and guarded by the Pthumerians, as the Pthumeru Ehil Chalice calls them, the humble guardians of slumbering Great Ones. Let's talk about the form that this guardianship would take.
He's mentioned that a couple times. I didn't want to mention it because it's kind of pedantic and I don't think it really matters, but the Japanese is slightly different, where it says they deify the sleep of the Great Ones. So they may not be guardians necessarily in the description itself, but to be fair, when we do fight the merciless watchers, the idea of watchers is that they're watching over the tombs. So I think even though he's slightly wrong here, he's mostly right because of the other incidental stuff.
By discussing three of the labyrinth's most iconic denizens: the Keeper of the Old Lords, Watchdog of the Old Lords, and the Right Keeper. I think the Right Keeper is a good place to start, and these are the witch-like enemies that can come in the crawling or the tall forms. While unusual looking, their appearance makes it clear that they are Pthumerian. Their appearance is of course very occult-like, witch-like, and their name suggests that they possess some religious or cult knowledge, and I have to say I absolutely love the aesthetics of these guys. The Bloodborne wiki, run by community member Meph, once again was a great source of information. On the page for these Right Keepers, the wiki notes that we actually got an official description of these enemies pre-release, and this was available on the Japanese Bloodborne website, which would read the following about the Right Keepers. Among the hunters survives the knowledge of individuals who pray for resting, a unique ritualist. People who do not know of the ritualist will be terrified by their appearance and demeanour, labelling them as disgusting and repulsive. Whereas that may be just pure prejudice, perhaps. Be especially mindful of the ritual masters, who perform a dark and ancient ceremony that few have lived to talk about. Now, of course, we have to treat these descriptions with a massive degree of skepticism.
Yeah, and that's pretty much exactly what I was going to say, because there was pre-release materials that went along with it, which said that the night of the hunt occurred every night, which I think can be more or less directly contradicted by the way Adela doesn't realize it's the night of the hunt when you find her in Yarhagul. It's hey idiot, how could you literally forget that every night is the night of the hunt? So there might have been a bit of a disconnect between some of the pre-release materials versus what we get in the final build of the game, but nonetheless, I do think that stuff is kind of fascinating to consider and can still inform us about certain things going on in the final game nonetheless.
As having looked at the others, and as you can see from this description, they are quite generic and don't quite fit in with the lore of the release game. That being said, I still think it's a good source when trying to understand the design intention behind each enemy. However, the last line is the most interesting to me, that refers to them as performing dark and ancient ceremonies. They are Rite Keepers after all, and so I do think this is in line with these beings as we see them in the game. This, in tandem with their name as Rite Keeper, leads me to speculate that these beings are ritualists who perform certain rituals in order to protect the labyrinth, perhaps even with a religious element mixed in to honour their patron gods. The term rite is also used elsewhere in regards to the labyrinths, in relation to the chalice rituals of the chalice dungeons. For example, in the description of Bloodshot Eyeball, which specifically uses the term rite. So to go even more into speculation territory, perhaps these Rite Keepers were also involved in the creation of these chalice dungeon rites, as if to preserve a part of the Holy Labyrinth, indefinitely in a pocket dimension. After all, Garmin does describe the chalice and performing a chalice dungeon ritual as a Holy Communion, and it is described in a similar religious fashion in the Pthumerian chalice description. There is another ritual mentioned in regards to the labyrinth, and I refer to the mysterious process mentioned Ash Set, the set of the Keepers of the Old Lords. The Bone Ash Mask reads the following: a mask made of bone ash, worn by the oldest Keepers. The Keepers who mined the slumbering Great Ones gained eternal life, preserved in ashen form, in a ceremony that cremated body and soul. The long pointed hat is a symbol of the old Keepers, and is considered evidence of their companionship, forged in a certain sin. The Keepers are very mysterious, and this item description describes a burning ceremony or ritual, which reduces them to ash, but somehow keeps them moving and immortal, so that they can serve as guardians to the Great Ones, the Old Lords. Given their appearance and affinity for fire, as well as a similar naming convention, I would assume that the watchdogs of the Old Lords are created via a similar purpose to these Keepers of the Old Lord. Both are very fiery creatures meant to safeguard the Old Lords, and presumably they were developed as part of the Pthumerians' guardianship over the Great Ones.
So yeah, I kind of agree with that idea about how the watchdogs were made and that they're probably similar to the Keepers. But just to give a little bit of extra context to the Bone Ash set, the English says they gained eternal life preserved in an ashen form in a ceremony of flame that cremated body and soul, which is pretty similar with the Japanese. They call it hellfire, but that's not too big a deal. They are made out of ash, which is a little bit unexpected. I mean, that is kind of what it's also saying in English, but the real big difference is that whatever happened to them wasn't forged in a certain sin. It's that they were all some kind of sinner. So the reason that these dudes got baked and turned into ash is because they were like guilty of some sort of crime. We don't exactly know what. And so their punishment was to become eternal keepers watching over the sleep of the Pthumerians, most likely. So just thought that's pretty cool to share.
To how they actually work and how they came to be, it's of course impossible for us to get the exact right answer. But in this universe of Bloodborne, any magic, quote-unquote, is essentially arcane, the manipulation of the cosmic elements of this world, and perhaps they are essentially powered by some sort of arcane manipulation. However, I have always wondered if there's something else at work with these keepers and watchdogs. We have already spoken about how people who ascend to higher planes, be it great ones or humans, sometimes leave their physical shells behind. We only face these beings in the chalice dungeons, which again, we've already discussed, I believe to be pocket dimensions or dreams. Is it possible then that these keepers and watchdogs are actually people that were burned in their corporeal form, burned to death in the real world, in a specific ritual so that their consciousness could be shackled and exist as a guardian in these sacred dungeons.
You know, that's an interesting thought that I hadn't quite considered that way, that their true bodies could have been burned and they're literally guarding the sleep and like the dreams of the Pthumerians. So like we might not be fighting Pthumerians directly, but we could just be fighting their dreams. I don't dislike that by any means. It's really interesting and something that I'd need to consider further. First gen spirit ashes? Yeah.
I leave it to you to decide. Ultimately, regardless of the specifics of how they work, I see them as the creations of the Pthumerians. However, something else is lost in translation here. The Bone Ash Mask talks about how this is forged in some kind of sin, and this language is a little confusing. However, thanks to Loki, we have a translation which makes the truth far clearer and far easier to understand. Loki's translation reads, "The large hat tapered to a point is a symbol of the old watchmen, and considered to be proof that they were some kind of sinners." So this makes sense, that these watchmen are essentially punished for a crime or for some other perceived slight against their culture, burned alive in these fire rituals, and repurposed into something more useful. So to conclude, I believe the labyrinth was first constructed,
which, now that I think about it a bit more, could make a bit of sense, because in the Hunter's Nightmare, we do have a lot of beast patients, and we could theorize that many people who were beast patients got burned in the burning of Old Yarnum. So could it be possible that burning something gives it more reason to exist in the nightmare? I mean, we do kind of have like a burning Lawrence, but that seems to be a little bit different, to be fair. Hey, Teen Sith, welcome into the stream. Nice to see you again. Interesting that they kept the pointy hat equals heresy / sin from Dark Souls. Yeah, I really do like the nods to their previous games, and this is almost like one-to-one to like Zoli's hat in DS2 and 3. Yeah, the Bone Ash set is so cool and more metal now. Oh yeah, you got more appreciation for it? Hell yeah.
constructed as a tomb, a place where great ones could go to ascend, and their bodies, left behind, would be guarded by their servants, the Pthumerians. But in time, these guardians would become their own nation, and it is to the Pthumerian monarchy and their culture that we turn to next. My assumption has always been that the Pthumerian monarchy is matriarchal, because of the importance that women would have had in their ongoing relationship with the Great Ones. And credit to Loki for pointing out the importance of an item description that basically outright confirms that this is the case, the Pthumeru Ehil Root Chalice, which reads the following. The Pthumerian monarch...
Yeah, and this is going to be a one that has a lot of important differences in the Japanese, especially with this final line here, which I am confident Smo's going to talk about next, but it just triggers me.
...was traditionally a woman who assumed a name with classical roots. So yes, their monarch was mainly a woman, and this will make sense as to why when we go over this in the following chapter, but it also makes an interesting remark about her name, that they would assume a name with classical roots. And to me, this is referring to the practice of a reign name, which is a name used by monarchs when they take up their new position that might not be necessarily their original birth name. For example, the last Queen of the United Kingdom was Queen Elizabeth II, but she wasn't born Queen Elizabeth II, she was just called Elizabeth, and her reign name was Elizabeth II because she was the second Queen of England to have that title. But there are
okay, I'll let him finish his point.
Examples of monarchs actually taking a different reign name than their actual first name. For example, Elizabeth's father was called Albert Frederick Arthur George, and called Albert by his family, but instead when he acceded to the throne, he chose King George as his title. And so, in short, it may be that Queen Yarnum is a traditional name amongst the Pthumerian monarchy, and she might be Queen Yarnum III or IV. And a lot of my evidence for such comes from the Vile Bloods of Cainhurst, who I see as the inheritors of the Pthumerian monarchy and analogous to their structure.
And yeah, just to go along with Smo's claims about the monarchy, even this naming convention can be found in like religious figures like popes.
They are two led by a queen called Annalise. And so let's start by connecting Annalise and Yharnam, and why I believe them to be analogous to one another. Even in a video I did 7 years ago on Cainhurst, I already made this connection, but thanks to the great work of Last Protagonist, I am able to refine my understanding of why I see these two as analogous for one another. And this is thanks to Last Protagonist's seminal video on the Vile Bloods, which I highly recommend you watch, and I will link below. Firstly, Last Protagonist points out that in the original Japanese, Annalise is referred to as Cainhurst's Blood Queen, and Queen Yharnam in her PlayStation achievement is called the Blood Queen of the Old Labyrinth. So they are both Blood Queens, and what this means will become more apparent as we continue to explore them.
Just wanted to say I appreciated the little trophy description sound effect, and also it feels like a cheat code to me anytime somebody uses the theme of the Great Grey Wolf Sif in a lore video.
Last Protagonist believes that this was meant to be an explicit connection between the two, but it was something that was lost in translation. To reinforce this intent, he points out that the full description of queenly flesh, the flesh left over by Annalise when she is murdered by Alfred, does describe her as the Blood Queen, despite the quick description not doing so. To understand the function that a Blood Queen plays, and why it's important to both the Vile Bloods and to Meru, we need to examine the function of the Vile Bloods. And as we move forward, I just want to make it explicit that credit for this goes to Last Protagonist, as I am drawing directly on his work to explain this. Last Protagonist...
okay, Smo, you can chill out a little bit. I appreciate the shoutouts, but it's okay to move on to the point.
Starts by pointing out the fact that when you join the Vile Bloods, you get the rune Corruption, or Kegare in the original Japanese, telling you at the onset that this clan is concerned with unfiltered and potent blood. Indeed, when we give Annalise a blood dreg, she rewards the player by giving us some of her own blood, at which point she says, "Feel the spreading corruption burn," suggesting that her blood is indeed impure. As I've said already in earlier chapters, Queen Yharnam's blood is also actually weaponized against us, not just in spear form, but she actually just sprays us with her blood, which does damage to us, once again suggesting that both of these queens have similar vile blood.
So in case anybody isn't on the Discord to share in the revelry, I want to share something with you guys live. Probably the greatest tweet I've ever seen. Man. YouTube essayist when they see a centipede in a Japanese game. It represents impurity and stagnation. So this just like ties into the whole Kegare stuff, which Smoughtown is talking about now. So this, when I saw this, I just felt so ridiculously called out.
Another connection between the two groups is the rune Blood Rapture. What is interesting is that the wording here is ambiguous enough that it could be describing the servants of Queen Annalise, or the servants of Queen Yharnam. And it is dropped by the Shadows of Yharnam, suggesting it could be referring to Queen Yharnam, and yet it is also dropped by the Bloody Crow of Cainhurst, the hunter found in the Grand Cathedral that appears to kill Aileen, Hunter of Hunters. And while I am unsure about which queen this rune is referring to specifically, I do think that it aptly describes the role of each queen in their respective societies. And the fact that it is dropped by a servant of Queen Yharnam, and then later a servant of Queen Annalise, is an illustration of that connection, and could suggest that the Shadows of Yharnam, who I believe to be the personal guard of Queen Yharnam herself, may have once played a similar role that the Vile Blood Hunters now play for Annalise. They were both responsible for searching for blood dregs for their queen, so that they could be surrogates for a great one. Additionally, the blood dreg item description gives us an insight into what we are actually trying to achieve by providing Annalise with blood dregs, as it reads, "Queen Annalise partakes in these blood dreg offerings so that she may one day bear the child of blood, the next Vile Blood heir." And as we are continuing to compare the two queens, the concept of a blood child should resonate when we consider the importance of children to the Great Ones, and the fact that Queen Yharnam herself bore a special child, Margot, One of the most basic facts of Bloodborne lore is that Great Ones yearn to have their own children. As the umbilical cord description reads, every Great One loses its child, and then yearns for a surrogate. Yet we can learn in-game that some surrogates are more suitable than others, and there is a specific reason that the Cainhursts and Pthumerians seek out this corrupted blood. As is highlighted by last Protagonist, we can get into the situation where there are actually two sources of blood for us in Erden Chapel.
So, Rain Transformed asked, isn't it a bit of an assumption that the Bloody Crow serves Annalise? Couldn't he just be a rogue agent? That is a good question, and Smo does address it, that he himself isn't sure whether or not the Crow is meant to serve Annalise. And I agree, and because he is kind of off doing his own thing, it is very difficult to explain what he's doing. For what it's worth, he does have like the Cainhurst mask on, and we are told that the followers of Cainhurst were the hunters of like the healing church, essentially. They are hunters of hunters in a way that's slightly different than like Eileen, because the hunters of hunters hunt the blood drunk, whereas the vile blood hunters just hunt hunters for their blood dregs specifically, which is kind of analogous to being blood drunk, but maybe slightly different. And it is important to note that Annalise seems to be unaware of the Bloody Crow's doings, so if he is acting, he's certainly not reporting in to his liege. You said the other day that the surrogate line doesn't exist. What's going on there? So, yeah, I did mention that, but I do think that the localization is probably more on the right track, and is just probably a little more explicit than the Japanese. So let's go pull up the umbilical cords again. So this line is kind of shared in tandem with all of the cord descriptions, if I'm remembering correctly. I guess maybe not the Willem one. Yeah, that's true. So other than the Yosefka third cord, they all say like all the Great Ones lose their children, their infants, and then they desire, but it doesn't say what exactly they desire, so you just have to infer that they still desire children. And so the rest of it doesn't really follow this line specifically, so it's just like they lose children and then they want. So it is technically ambiguous as to what they want, but yeah. It just feels extremely dissatisfying to say it like that in English, whereas like the Japanese, it's not too uncommon to leave sentences dangling like that, sort of. You'd always assume they desired a surrogate mother. Actually, let me look at that again. Yeah, just the fact that it says that they lose their children and then they desire another doesn't really make it sound like they lose their parent. Like, it's not like they lose their infancy, it's that they lose their infant. So I liked the idea, even if I don't think it works out. Killer King says the Crow Hunter Bloody Crow may have been a vile blood who got drunk on that Annalise blood, and he's only Eileen's target because of the abuse, not because of the blood type being bad. No, I'm not trying to say like their blood type is bad. I'm just saying like the fact that they go out and hunt hunters in search of blood is similar to being blood drunk. It's just kind of like the motives are different and they're kind of in more control. Oh, you're saying that they wanted a surrogate mother to have their baby. Yeah, I don't know. Actually, I'm going to look at all three of those descriptions. Either way, if they're searching for a surrogate mother, they still kind of want children, I think is the ultimate reading of that. Yeah, that explains Eileen's ending. You determined that Great Ones can't come to term, which is why they impregnate humans. Okay, it looks like we're on the same page here. And hey, Bella, welcome back to the stream. Oh, you were here for a while. Maybe I just missed you. Oh, thanks. Okay, going back to the video.
Two people willing to give us their blood. Adela the nun and Ariana, women of the night. Adela is very insecure about the quality of her own blood.
Forgive me, I should have known better. What would a brave hunter do with lowly blood like mine? Please, forget I even asked.
And seems jealous if you choose Ariana's blood over hers, even looking directly at you when you're talking to Ariana.
Yeah, I just love that little detail. She looks so goofy when she does it, and she can go crazy and attack her.
And should this continue without you intervening, Adela will eventually kill Ariana out of jealousy. You can even find blood on her gloves. And eventually, when the red moon is hanging low,
I'm gonna back
Adela
it
will
up a
try
little
and
bit.
kill you. If you choose Ariana,
I even asked.
and seems jealous if you choose Ariana's blood over hers, even looking directly at you when you're talking to Ariana. And should this continue without you intervening, Adela will eventually kill Ariana out of jealousy.
So yeah, his language is a little bit vague there, but he's not exactly wrong. So it's not just like continuing on after taking Ariana's blood once. I'm pretty sure you need to use Ariana's blood 3 times in a row or 3 times total. I'm not sure which actually. And then Adela will lose her mind and kill her. And it's a little bit easier said than done because you need to like reload the area to get the items again, which is kind of a big pain in the ass and one of the weaknesses of Bloodborne in my opinion. I forgive you, Bella. It's all good.
You can even find blood on her gloves. And eventually, when the red moon is hanging low, Adela will try and kill you, thinking that your blood is tainted, given that you have received so many transfusions from Ariana. The reason Adela is so jealous of Ariana and why she thinks your blood will be tainted is because Ariana has ties to the Vile Bloods, meaning her blood is actually more potent than someone like Adela's. And the reason we know this is because Ariana is wearing the noble dress, a dress associated with the Cainhursts. Perhaps she is a descendant or someone who escaped the massacre by the executioners at the castle. Adela indirectly calling her blood tainted, as well as the use of the word forbidden in the item description of Ariana's blood, helps cement her connection to the Vile Bloods. And while the church might deem their blood forbidden or vile, it is indeed Ariana who is chosen to be a surrogate for the Great Ones. At the end of Ariana's quest, we find her with a cosmic child, and we find the source of this child via the umbilical cord that it drops when killed. It reads the following: "Every Great One loses its child, and then yearns for a surrogate, and Erden, the formless Great One, is no different. To think it was corrupted blood that began this eldritch liaison." This plainly says that it was Ariana's corrupted or vile blood that was the reason she was chosen by Erden to be its surrogate. Ariana, not Adela. Adela herself is a young woman and you think would be a suitable surrogate. However, even if Ariana is killed and Adela is the only one in Erden Church, she will not be chosen as a surrogate. It is corrupted blood that is the key. Last Protagonist does go in.
Hey, without horns, thanks for the sub. Maybe I should be more, what's the word? Consistent in recommending people like the channel and subscribe rather than just the few times I say it a bit ironically here and there. So yeah, thanks, and welcome back to the streams. Nectarine said, it's kind of weird that they say what was once forbidden about the blood as if the church is cool with vile bloods now. So I understand where you're coming from with that. However, I think in the modern day era of Bloodborne, when the Good Hunter visits the city, that the Vile Bloods must have been extinguished for a good enough period of time where a lot of people have kind of forgotten about the raid on Cainhurst. Which tends to be why I think it may have occurred before Old Yarnum was burned, because people have more living memory of Old Yarnum than they seem to do of Cainhurst, although they may have just never cared because Yarnumites are jerks. Yeah, the special spicy blood, the Kigare blood. It's annoying that Ariana has extra dialogue after you take her blood, meaning you need to both reload the area constantly and do it before saving Adela to see it. Yeah, or I'm pretty sure you could take like Adela's blood in between the two and probably be fine. Okimin wonders if Adela knows that Ariana has a relationship to the Vile Bloods, or is just jealous of you going to see the prostitute for blood over her. I don't necessarily think she knows about the Vile Blood specifically, as much as it is she sees Adela sees Ariana as a whore, and she realizes Ariana must have better blood than her. Oh, yeah. So, there's another line in the Japanese text that's a bit different. In what is it? It might be. I think it's Ariana's dialogue specifically. So okay. Even though Ariana is like canonically a prostitute, the Japanese lines for when she what am I doing? Pressing all the wrong buttons. Not 10. When she says she offers us blood and then we deny it, I think. I don't remember the context of this. She says, if you ever change your mind, you know where I'll be. Whereas the Japanese is a lot more direct. Wait, no. Okay, I think I lost it. Hold on, let me... Okay. So I think... disregard what I said about the refusal of the blood. I was just a tab or one cell lower. So... okay, it's after she goes into Cathedral Ward's tomb or Chapel of Odin, and she says, "Oh, hello, dear, you weren't lying. This is a safe place. Thank you, I am in your debt." And then she curtsies, or gives us the curtsy gesture. And then to men, she says, "I'd like to tender my thanks, but I haven't much to offer." And then to female, she says, "I'd like to tender my thanks, but I can't imagine what to offer." So when she offers her blood, it makes it sound like something more sexual in nature since she doesn't know what to offer women. However, the Japanese here is kind of similar with like the woman thing, but she has a little bit of extra dialogue. Wait, is this just not in the English at all? Oh, she says, "But would you even take a whore's blood?" Okay, yeah, that's what it is. So this final line here is, "All I can give is my blood, but would you even take a whore's blood?" And this part is gendered in Japanese. So only Japanese male characters actually get the full story, in that Ariana says, "Do you hate women who sell blood?" And to women, she says, like, "Do you hate the blood of prostitutes?" So the fact that she's able to sell blood, to me, implies that her blood must be of a much higher quality if she's able to sell what the Healing Church is giving out for free. And the reason why I say the Healing Church is giving it out for free is because of blood ministration being called like the alms of blood, or the charity of blood charity in Japanese, with alms being like what churches have historically given to like the destitute to help them kind of subsist within poverty. So, yeah. Forgot about all that context there. Isn't the church borderline destroyed by the start of Bloodborne anyway? I mean, you could definitely make that case with like pretty much the entire town transforming. Could be why it was once forbidden, since the church isn't around to forbid it anymore. I think the church is still around, but they probably thought their situation with Canehurst was resolved, so they just kind of conveniently forgot about it because it's essentially irrelevant to them now. The Archangel's opener is literally "Be Not Afraid," and there's a whole melodrama about the Immaculate Conception because Mary and Joseph weren't wed. I think I missed a little bit of context there. Oh, maybe I didn't. I don't know. Just not following entirely. Another thing to add to the ways that women are oppressed. Limited Bloodborne lore. Shake your head, Yeah. So, women are treated like simultaneously, like, they're placed on a pedestal and also objectified. I mean, I guess that's kind of the same thing to a certain degree, but objectified has a bit more derogatory connotations nowadays in English, so hopefully you're picking up what I'm putting down. Oh no, I just realized how sexist that is. Telling the women to pick up what I'm putting down. You wonder if she makes more money on her body or her blood. Yeah, that's a good question. You think there's some flavor text talking about the potency of blood compared to other pleasures? So there's certainly the one with the alcohol. What's it called? It's not like fermented wine, but it's something similar to that. Anyway, I think you guys know what I'm talking about. So, like, the blood is more intoxicating than alcohol, but I don't know about, like, carnal pleasures. Blood cocktail, that's what it is. Yeah. The Healing Church timeline always confuses Nectarine. Sometimes they seem like relative newcomers to Yharnam, but then who built the Cathedral Ward? So that's a very good question, and there is obviously a strong possibility that many of the buildings in Cathedral Ward pre-existed the Healing Church's arrival there. And for what it's worth, the tomb of, or sorry, not the tomb, but the Chapel of Odin is technically in the very center of Cathedral Ward. So it's possible that it was literally the epicenter of that ward or that district before the Healing Church arrived and then put the Grand Cathedral up at the top. I know in Tarnished Archaeologist's latest video, he's trying to insinuate that the Grand Cathedral was probably there predating the Healing Church. I don't really know about that. I mean, it kind of makes sense if you think that the woman with the wings came from the civilization before Lawrence's time, but I don't know. Just because there is probably an extremely long period of time when the Pthumerians died out, then the Yharnamites did their own stuff, kind of forgetting about their ancient past, and then Lawrence set up shop. And then it certainly doesn't help that, like, the entirety of Yharnam is architecturally unsound and filled with a bunch of random-ass statues that don't make any sense for their placements. Although, man, if I were to live in Yharnam, I would probably make bank if I was a statue maker, wouldn't I? Do you think the church giants and the lantern scythe guys are Pthumerian descendants? I don't necessarily know. I think it's possible that the Healing Church could have conducted research with blue elixirs and inadvertently made their own style of Pthumerians with the elders and descendants, or not like the elders, but like with the church servants. But it is also possible that they may have been able to brainwash some of them to work for them, because we do have the School of Mensis in cahoots with some of the Pthumerian madwomen, which are like the bell ringers. So I really wish we had more info about those connections in general there. It's funny that you say your headcanon is the big church guys are all Frankensteins, because one of their internal names is like Dungeon Franken, which is like Dungan Frankenstein. So yeah, no. They also thought that they were Frankensteins, apparently. The monsters, that is, not the man. Did you guys hear that Frankenstein entered a bodybuilding competition? They thought he misunderstood the premise.
Into the nature of corrupted blood, of the blood dregs, and why it's so important. But I will leave it to them, as they do a far better job than I ever could. And again, I highly recommend their Vile Blood video in case you want to learn more. But in short, these blood dregs, and corrupted or vile blood in general, is just blood in a more potent and concentrated form. And the process by which you obtain a blood dreg is far more visceral in nature, as they need to be sought from the actual blood of hunters. Whereas blood ministration is a more kind of medical or scientific procedure, despite it being quite ghastly as well. And the reason they might be found in hunters makes a lot of sense. Hunters are beings who imbibe a lot of blood. Indeed, the blood dreg refers to them as echo fiends, as they consume a lot of blood echoes, and thus it makes sense that hunters and their bodies would be the source of the most concentrated of blood. Indeed, even in regular blood echoes, when you look at the more concentrated versions, you see almost embryos in the centre of it, as if it is close to being able to produce an infant great one. And in blood dregs, if you look closely, it looks like the male reproductive cell, as if this is also playing a role in being able to produce an infant great one. And while it's difficult to say how this process exactly works, it is clear that having this concentrated blood within your body would make you a suitable host for creating an infant great one. But again, the very fact that these blood dregs, this concentrated form of blood, is found filtered within the bodies of hunters, that hunters need to be ripped apart to essentially get at this viscera, again returns us to the image of vile bloods and Pthumerians themselves being closer to vampires than the werewolves that are born of the medical procedures of the healing church. The blood dreg describes these hunters, these vile blood hunters, as blood-lusting, and blood rapture describes the fact that they find almost joy in being splashed with blood. The corruption rune suggests that only vile blood hunters with this rune can see blood dregs within the blood, and indeed we will only get this drop if we are using the corruption rune. And so I would suggest that it is this rune that has an influence on the senses of vile blood hunters. Not only that they can see these blood dregs, but they sort of develop a lust for blood. Again, vampires. And it is also hinted that by having enough of this concentrated blood, these blood dregs, you gain immortality, much like a vampire. And I believe this thanks to the description of the Yharnam stone, dropped by Queen Yharnam, and the queenly flesh, dropped by Annalise. Both of these items suggest that Yharnam and Annalise continue to live despite the fact their bodies have been destroyed. I would doubt this is the case for Pthumerians in general, or even other members of the Cainhurst royal family. Rather, Queen Annalise and Queen Yharnam are at the top of their respective hierarchies. They are the vessels that receive the most corrupted blood, and thus are so saturated by this form of life that they are unable to die truly. And this brings us to the Ring of Betrothal, an item that is found in the Chalice dungeons, which reads the following. The inhuman beings known as the Great Ones imbued this Ring of Betrothal with some special meaning. In the age of the Great Ones, wedlock was a blood contract, only permitted to those slated to bear a special child.
So we did talk about this briefly on last stream, in that I think it's possible with Smoughtown's arguments here that Queen Yharnam herself doesn't die, and she does seem to be inhuman or superhuman to a certain degree, could be used to argue that Queen Yharnam herself is a Great One of some design, which, I think is a pretty strong possibility here, all things considered. But we also had another question in chat that Nothingness had asked, and it was, do you think Yharnam's pregnancy was what she wanted, or was she forced? You think the Blood Rapture rune implies that it wasn't forced, with the allusions to Queen Annalise? So, I do think it's possible that the ring could have been given meanings by Yharnam, or like the monarchy of the Pthumerians, and the Pthumerians could arguably be Great Ones to some degree. But, I mean, that's also a stretch because of the things that we were talking about yesterday with... What chalice was it? I think it was defiled something. Oh, just the defiled chalice. That curses are caused by inciting the anger of the Great Ones and used to hex others. Special materials are required to complete the ritual. To try one's hand at curses, first seek the Bastard of Lauren. Okay, yeah, and so with this one specifically, I'm pretty sure like the Japanese talks about... No, I always forget what description talks about like the dudes getting stimulated. But anyway, if the denizens of those chalices are typically like Pthumerians and whatnot, could that imply that the Pthumerians are these Great Ones that are getting angered by these messed up rituals? It's arguable. I don't fully buy it, but I think it's kind of important to give people some ammo for their headcannon, for their artillery fire. And what else was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So with Queen Yharnam herself, I do think it's kind of a symbolic marriage that the Pthumerians may have like placed a ton of importance on the concept of a child of blood or something along those lines, because it could be possible to view the child of blood as like the culmination of their civilization, with them imbibing the blood of the dead, which has like the echoes and the spirits of the dead within it. They're kind of reabsorbing all of them who ever like lived and putting them into like their progeny. So it's kind of like them being connected to the past, the present, and the future, if they're able to create a great one that exists beyond the mortal coil, perhaps. They might not have put that much like belief into it. I don't really know. I'm just giving some ideas here. But the reason why I think it was a little bit more voluntary, despite like the Blood Rapture rune, is that when we fight Yharnam and when we see her, she is shackled, but she is very easily to break the shackles if she so chooses. So somehow it kind of seems to be like perhaps more of a symbolic shackling or fettering of Marika to the Golden Order, or Rennala to the Golden Order, you know, just kind of like that idea of the Pthumerian monarch kind of being subservient to a greater power, which could be the Great Ones beyond, or maybe her child. I don't know. So anyway, whether or not the Great One child within Yharnam came from an external Great One like Udin, or was a natural byproduct of just imbibing blood dregs, is very debatable. And I think you could argue it all night long, essentially, just because of Udin existing in voice and creating a child with Annalise and potentially Yosefka and or others, and he could potentially be the father of like Murgo or like Queen Yharnam's child. We don't really know though. So anyway. You theorized that Yharnam might have become a Great One because of her undying status, but Annalise supposedly hasn't had a child of blood yet, right? We don't necessarily know that, even without the core description, because you could make the argument that Gehrman may have had ties to Cainhurst initially because he knew Maria. Maybe Bergenworth was a subsidiary of Cainhurst, was employed by Cainhurst, or like at least bankrolled by them, so they might have given a lot of their research to Cainhurst to begin with. Just that could potentially like tie into what Alfred's story is, although Alfred's story could be slightly off of a basis because it's kind of healing church propaganda. So anyway, Annalise could have had a child of blood, and I think it's very likely because when you do offer, yeah, I may as well just show the footage. Annalise. Whenever you offer her the ring of betrothal... Oh, wrong folder. Whenever you offer her the ring of betrothal, she says that she doesn't want something like that to happen again. So she seems to be looking out for the player.
Cainhurst, without his knights. Odd, well, church of Chidmar.
Okay, so that's that part. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Proposed marriage.
Speak not those words. We have little need of a consort. Such a path would belike lead to further ruin. Thou art dear to us. We would see no harm befall thee.
So Annalise seems to have some fairly intimate knowledge about the Ring of Betrothal, which I think is very important in considering that this is technically like a Pthumerian relic. So does she know what happened to the Pthumerians? Did something happen to her in like Annalise's personal past? We don't know, but at the very least, she seems to understand what that kind of contract can entail. And it's very curious that she says like it would lead to our ruin. And I've wondered whether or not that kind of ruin could be a reference to what happened to Gehrman specifically, and or the creation of the Hunter's Dream. But of course, a lot of that stuff is very contingent on what they actually wanted to come across in the retail build of the game versus previous builds of the game. So plenty of room open for interpretation, and we just kind of have to come to our own conclusions, I think. What if Maria was a child of blood? I mean, it's kind of possible to a degree because she does use like a lot of blood style magic and a lot of fire that comes along with it. But at the very least, she is like a cousin of Queen Annalise. So I don't think she's actually likely to be a child of blood, although I'm certain you were just saying that in jest. But nonetheless, I still think it's kind of got a valid question beneath the surface there. All right, going back to the video.
Only permitted to those slated to bear a special child. While this ring is not explicitly mentioned to be connected to the Pthumerians, all this talk of blood contracts and special children of course makes me think of Queen Yharnam and Murgle. And again, Last Protagonist makes a great observation in his Vile Blood video that Queen Yharnam does appear to be wearing a ring of betrothal on her finger. And Queen
Hey, thanks, Smo. I forgot to bring that up in chat right now.
Annalise, while rejecting your proposal, if you propose with it to her, at least seems to recognise what the purpose of the ring is, which tracks with what we have said about the Vile Bloods being the inheritors of the Pthumerians. And aside from this, the Ring of Betrothal mentions an Age of the Great Ones, where these wedding contracts took place, and to me, the Age of the Great Ones can only be the Age of the Pthumerians. Aside from the fact that this ring is only found within the Labyrinth, we also know that the Pthumerians had a much closer relationship to the Great Ones than humans do, and thus it would make sense that their era was called the Age of the Great Ones. In my Great Ones lore video, I suggested that Murgo's wet nurse was perhaps the Great One that was quote-unquote married to Queen Yharnam as the other half of her blood pact, that wet nurse used Yharnam as a surrogate for Murgo, and as such the wet nurse will have had a great influence on late Pthumerian culture. Murgo's loft in the Nightmare of Mensis is an interesting building. Firstly, it is called Murgo's loft, suggesting it is associated with the Pthumerian heir rather than with the School of Mensis. In Murgo's loft, the basic enemy types are known as Murgo's attendants, and while initially it might be unclear as to what these beings are, if they're human or other, if you look under their armour, it quickly becomes clear that they are Pthumerian. If the denizens of Murgo's loft are Pthumerian, I would therefore speculate that the building itself is either a reflection of the Pthumerian palace that Murgo was located in, or is literally the original palace that has been drawn into the nightmare, and Murgo's servants, attendants, were brought with it. If this is the case, then we can finally get some sort of insight into royal Pthumerian culture beyond the labyrinth itself. Inside Murgo's loft, in the main atrium, you can find bird cages hanging in large numbers, and this had always been a mystery to me, until I'd considered this building as a reflection of an original Pthumerian one, perhaps the palace that Murgo lived in. If this was true, and as I say, Wet Nurse was the other side of Yharnam's blood pact, and interacted with Pthumeru in some capacity, perhaps then these cages are a sort of homage to the crow-like Great One. Bear in mind the Great Ones are no doubt perceived as gods by the Pthumerian people, and perhaps these bird cages were filled with crows to honour their god, though I accept this is very much my own speculation. However, what is more difficult to ignore is the similarity that the Shadows of Yharnam have to the Wet Nurse of Murgo. Underneath their cloaks, you can see that these are essentially regular Pthumerians. They are just wearing a sort of black cloak. As I have said, given their name and analogous tie to the Vile Blood Hunters via the Blood Rapture rune, I've always assumed that these are the royal guard or servants of Queen Yharnam, her shadows. Indeed, their presence surrounding Queen Yharnam's position in the Nightmare of Mensis could be taken as further evidence of this. and yet I would argue that their appearance is meant to honour and emulate the appearance of Murgo's wet nurse, the god to which their queen was symbolically married to.
So yeah, I don't necessarily agree that Yharnam was married to Murgo's wet nurse. Just because there's like other possibilities with like Odin and stuff. I guess to be like a little bit weird about it, it is kind of like a little bit unintuitive to think of the two being paired, because if the wet nurse is a wet nurse, it would imply she's female, and it just becomes a little bit awkward to think of two females birthing a child. But if the wet nurse is a great one, maybe that kind of a limitation of biology is less of a factor there. I don't know. I need to consider that a bit more. And then Stella had a funny comment that the only answer they've ever really wanted is why Annalise still has the helmet on if you resurrect her. Like a reason other than not having to make another model. It's because time was rewound. So it's not like you're taking her back together. It's she got rewinded.
Indeed, if they are analogous to vile blood hunters, and they were meant to source blood dregs and sources of corrupted blood to give to Queen Yharnam, so that she may become the perfect surrogate for a special child, perhaps their outfits are a reflection of their oath to fulfill the agreement between Queen Yharnam and the wet nurse of Murgo. It may be a stretch, but within the labyrinth itself we find statues that are comparable to Victorian-era photos of mothers and their children.
Alright, the other thing that I did want to mention with like the cages is that we do have a couple of cages which appear in the Chalice dungeons that typically have people embedded within them, or like their corpses. I'm pretty sure they're called crow's nests. No, I think that might just be the Navy term. I always forget what they're actually called. I think they were called like a crow's cage or something in like Willow, and that's always stuck in my mind, even though it isn't technically true. So anyway, aside from the ones that have bodies in the Chalice dungeons, there's a couple that will like that you could ride up from like the bottom floors of the gardens that randomly appear in the Chalice dungeons. So there's a couple of different kinds of cages in them as well. Of course, they do look a bit more distinct from the kinds of cages that we can find in Murgo's loft, specifically the ones that have like eye pendant symbols on their bases. So like if you step on the eyes, they like act as switches, which like allows you to literally transcend where you are in a physical sense. So anyway, Murgo's wet nurse, cages, veils, shadows of Yharnam. I don't think there's anything else. So I'm going to continue.
Known as Hidden Mother Photography. And again, shout out to Sinclair Lore for making me aware of this phenomena in their wet nurse video. And I agree with Sinclair Lore that this is what the visual design of the wet nurse is meant to evoke. A sort of hidden mother figure. The hidden, unseen mother to Murgo, and perhaps to Meru as a whole. And again, returning to the statues found within the labyrinth, perhaps these are designs, artistic representations of this wet nurse, unseen by the majority of the Pthumerian population. But aside from the blood pact between their queen and the Great Ones, what else can we tell about this society at the height of their power?
So the other thing that I did remember was, if he wants to lean on the idea of Murgo's wet nurse being a great one related to like Pthumeru and stuff, you might be able to use like the crow feather garb and the idea of sky burials being more an homage to the wet nurse, who has more like raven or crow-like imagery going on with her character design. Blood baby formula, the old milk. Oh god. Cursed chat is cursed.
Well, we don't get much, but there are some other things we can learn if we dig deep. We can surmise that aside from the queen, they had some sort of elder hierarchy, due to the Pthumerian elders, who clearly have the title elder to signify their authority. Perhaps this is also represented by the staffs that they have. And aside from anything else, the power of these Pthumerian elders is very impressive compared to the other humanoid enemies that we face within the labyrinth. We can also tell that Pthumeru had some kind of military, equatable to a medieval era army, as we see knights' armour and cannons littered throughout the labyrinth. Further to this, there are enemies known as labyrinth warriors, and while these are clearly far from knights, I do think they are evidence of a ruined culture's military, as the worn and falling apart armour could be evidence that these were once Pthumerian knights, or at the very least, they have scavenged Pthumerian knight armour and now wield them. Either way, in my mind, I speculate that Pthumerian warriors were armed like this, just a bit more refined.
So another thing that's kind of fun to consider is how many Pthumerians actually wield firearms, the ones that like shoot the rifles essentially at kind of long range, which is a little bit counterintuitive or unintuitive that if these things are so ancient, why the hell do they have firearms? Did they loot them off of the Healing Church tomb prospectors or something along those lines? It's just kind of a funny... I do think the cannons could have potentially been brought in by the Healing Church, but like a lot of the more primitive like rifles do feel a little bit at odds in time at times. However, perhaps the deeper you go, like the further back in their civilization's history they go.
Another potential facet of Pthumerian society that we need to consider is witchcraft and the occult. In the earlier chapters, we looked at the Labyrinth Rite Keepers and the Keepers of the Old Lords as aspects of their guardianship over slumbering Great Ones. And a question that crops up in my mind is, did these rites continue when the Pthumerians became their own people, when they crowned a monarch? The fact that we can still encounter both in the Chalice dungeons does seem to suggest that the cult elements from their earlier age did persist into the Royal Pthumerian era. An aspect I didn't touch on though were the bell-ringing women, who are now used by the School of Mensis in their rituals, and again, as we can see from their features, they do appear to be at least Pthumerian descendants, if not Pthumerians themselves. They are found in the Labyrinth most numerously, aside from the Nightmare of Mensis, reinforcing their connection to that fallen civilization. The bell-ringing women seem to be able to pull Nightmare Apostles from other dimensions. We discussed this in my Great Ones video, but we know that these Nightmare Apostles, these spiders, were once humans thanks to a quote from Miyazaki himself from that original Future Press Guide interview, in which he spoke about patches. So the Nightmare Apostles, as their name...
So yeah, I'm a little bit surprised Smo didn't mention it, but the bell-bearing women are like canonically Pthumerians? Okay, yeah. So obviously there's going to be a little bit of English to Japanese plurality discrepancies going on, where it says the bell-ringing woman appears to be a mad Pthumerian, so this should be like women. Actually, I don't know. Let me look at the Japanese. Okay, yeah, so it could seem like singular. So yeah, anyway, the bell-ringing women appear to be mad Pthumerians. So I guess it is technically like speculation here, like Dearo, but I don't really think there's a lot of reason to doubt it because they do appear down there in the chalices as well. And yeah, we did mention that it is kind of weird that the School of Mensis has such a direct connection with the mad bell-ringing women, and we really have no idea how or why that came to be, or what either's goals are with using each other, other than using some weird-ass rituals to summon the Wonderborn. Yeah, I used Frost and Bleed against the Deathrite Bird because I was able to stomp everything else, and that was my stubbornness. But there's a difference between being stubborn and patient. Hey, Drunk Mage, welcome in. For some reason, people don't usually associate plate and chain with guns, even though they coexisted. That's true, but it was fairly brief, historically speaking, considering like how long the Bronze Age was, the Iron Age was, etc. Yokade equals Yarnum confirmed. One might consider stubbornness to be angry patience. Perhaps.
Names suggest are deeply rooted in the nightmare and dream realms. And as such, when I see a bell-ringing woman use their bells, I believe we are witnessing them use acoustics to manipulate the barriers between worlds.
I 1000% agree with that, and I do talk about that kind of idea a lot in depth of my video about the divine secret of the Eldritch Truth, which is a little bit of play on words because like divine secret means arcane. So it's like the arcane of the arcane, essentially. But anyway, the acoustic stuff is extremely important to Bloodborne because the timbre of bells can cross dimensions. As we see with carol runes, they exist in voice, which is basically an acoustic method of transmitting information, and also with the cries of the infant Murgo, which is kind of similar to the idea behind carol runes, I suppose. And then that also gets brought up in items like the Rose Marinus, the way that Abritus's aura kind of like chimes when you get close to her, and the one that like saps your HP, and a bunch of other small stuff like the Gardens of Eyes attacks, as well as like what Smoughtown had brought up, like the kind of a static, distorted fuzz of the Celestial Emissaries, perhaps. This is why you say 500 years ago wasn't really that long ago. For me, it's really like the cutoff of being like in the 1800s, when we start to get like the Industrial Revolution. I feel like that is like the last greatest cutoff, and then probably something more akin to the very early 1900s with the advent of flight and just the technology boom which followed it. But yeah, just the absolute pace of technology improving over human history is just out of control right now compared to how it used to be.
To draw beings from one side of a dream to theirs. This does make a lot of sense, as we do hear Murgo's cries in the waking world, despite the fact he is not present here. He is present within the nightmare, suggesting that certain noises do penetrate between worlds. And later we see the bell-ringing women being used by the School of Mensis to create the One Reborn. And as I said in my Great One's lore video, I believe that the One Reborn is a Great One's mind trapped inside a physical body, and it is the School of Mensis' attempt to trap a Great One's mind on this side of the dream. And the bell-ringing women play a role in this by beckoning the mind or consciousness of a Great One into this new physical form. And so to surmise, these bell-ringing women are just another Pthumerian device for them to make contact with their gods, the Great Ones. We don't know exactly what led to the collapse of Pthumerian society, but given the last Queen of Yharnam, or at least some remnant of her consciousness, can be found in the Nightmare of Mensis crying for her lost child, we can hazard a guess. It seems like whatever is left of the Pthumerian kingdom is frozen at this moment in time. We find an instance of Queen Yharnam pregnant with Murgo in Pthumeru Ihil, the capital of their kingdom. And for me, these are the last days before the collapse of the Empire. Before Murgo was taken away from Queen Yharnam, her consciousness would soon follow, seeking a way back to Murgo. We see her after our fight with Rom, when we break the seal that hides the ritual, as if she has been waiting here, waiting for someone who can remove the last barrier to Murgo. And thus I think the taking of Murgo broke Yharnam, broke the monarchy, and thus the kingdom. Leaderless and directionless, over certain generations they would regress into the forms we now know as the Watchers. There is no other queen after Yharnam, and so to me she is the last of their monarchy, and the kingdom ended with her. With that said, let us now talk about those Watcher descendants, and the legacy of the Pthumerians as a whole.
So, I kind of agree with what Smoughtown is saying, but I kind of disagree with perhaps the way he may have set it up. He makes it sound, or at least I might be misinterpreting him, in that I think he's saying that the civilization of Pthumeru ended when Yharnam's child was kind of stolen from her, which, depending on where you want to place that in the timeline, you could say it was like Lawrence, and that could have like happened way, way, way after the Pthumerians had kind of like died out. That would make a lot of sense. But if he's trying to imply that like the child was kidnapped earlier than that, I would kind of disagree. But anyway, the way that I look at the Pthumerians is that they probably existed for a fairly long time, but then once they got to the point where they could produce Great One children, and they themselves may have become akin to Great Ones, and then essentially lost the ability to reproduce themselves. And obviously, if you can't reproduce, you can't continue, so the civilization would die out for one reason or another. With the whole Chalice Dungeon situation being questionable about whether we visit their like physical locations or the dream instantiations of those, we don't really have a lot of living Pthumerians with which we can compare things. Although there are still like the gigantic chapel church servants in Cathedral Ward, as well as a couple below Yosefka's clinic in like the poison cave down there, whatever you want to call it, and maybe some of the church servants. But either way, I think Pthumeru died out because they completed the job, they mission complete, they became great ones, or at least the culmination of their civilization and their practices led to birthing, well, like, relatively speaking, a great one. Creating a great one may be a better way to phrase that instead of like birthing. But anyway. Scaleezy says, does the One Reborn lag out anyone else's game? He staggers so much all the blood sprays made your PS4 struggle. Yeah, that's just kind of how Bloodborne ran, unfortunately. It was a little bit rough. Especially when it's already 30 FPS baseline. Alright, going into the legacy of Pthumeru.
Despite the Pthumerian kingdom being a thing of the past, we see the signs of the Pthumerians everywhere, including on the surface world, where they have been put to work by the various factions of the church. It is not a revelation to say that the church servants, given their stature and facial features and pale skin, are of Pthumerian descent, as are the long-limbed kidnappers of the School of Menses, which can also incidentally be found in the Labyrinth. Now, given all we have discussed, it might seem a little odd to accept that these mighty superhuman beings are now essentially used as menial labour or muscle by the church, but it does become clear that the Pthumerians are not quite what they once were. The Watchers are quite clearly degenerate descendants of the Pthumerians. Not only do they have similar features, but they are found within the Labyrinth after all, the collapsed bones of Pthumerian civilization. And just for clarity, there are two classes of Watchers. The skinny regular enemies of the Labyrinth, the enemies that you will fight most commonly within there. And then there are the merciless Watchers, the bigger fellas, who often act as bosses within the Chalice dungeons. It is worth noting there is another variant of Watchers, the Gravediggers, and these are the ones with the black cloaks, often seen with pickaxes, and are presumably the ones that help extend the Hintertombs. But the reason I bring them up is because these particular types of Watchers are even more Pthumerian in appearance, with their faces almost matching those of the Pthumerian Elder and Descendant, and thus it makes the connection between the Watchers and Pthumerians that much stronger. Returning to Bob the Hollow's video on the Pthumerians, he makes a great observation regarding the Watchers, the merciless ones to be specific. Bob makes the point that in certain boss fights, where you fight multiple versions of the merciless Watchers, that some are often referred to as chieftains, suggesting that these Watchers, the Pthumerian descendants, have reverted to a very basic clan structure. Their attire does seem to reinforce this idea. Rather than the fine silks of Queen Yarnum or the Pthumerian elders, these Watchers wear sort of barbarian furs.
So I do think there are a couple other Pthumerians you could make the argument of existing, although I don't exactly know where Smoughtown is going with this, because, I mean, obviously there's different kinds of Pthumerians, but anyway, the knightly armor-wearing ones that Smoughtown had mentioned earlier are something worth considering. You might be able to make the argument that the Forgotten Madmen are as well, and maybe not like the Forgotten Madmen, because I think that's actually the name of the Hintertomb boss, which are hunter NPCs, but like the Sadako looking ones, like the one from like The Grudge or The Ring, whatever it is, the ones that like run at you like crazy and their frame rate is all off, so it just scares the hell out of people. Although, yeah, I think those things only actually appear in Lauren, so maybe they're technically not Pthumerian now that I think about it. So anyway, we had some extra people join the chat. Jan Jarvis, Jay Dixon, Tyler, Koya Musa, welcome all in. Are the messengers some kind of Pthumerians? You've been diving into Bloodborne lore recently, but you rarely seen them brung up besides in passing. So it's interesting that you bring that up, and I was actually holding off on saying it for a little bit because I didn't know if Smoughtown was going to go into it, because earlier in the video he was talking about the Pthumerians and their appearances, and he attributed it to them being kind of underground and lacking sunlight, which is sort of technically true according to some pre-release material, but my opinion would differ, and the way that I look at Pthumerians is their physiology may have been influenced by the blood that they've been imbibing, and the blood has the spirits of the dead within it, and spirits of the dead is kind of a reference to blood echoes, because blood echoes in Japanese is shino-ishi, which means like the dying wills of blood. So blood contains the leftover wishes, dreams, and desires of the deceased, which is kind of analogous to souls, especially if you like consider them like mechanically in Bloodborne compared to like souls and demon souls or dark souls. So are there souls in the blood? And if so, what are they? I think that answer becomes pretty clear in the very beginning cutscene of the game, where after the hunter NPC is given their blood transfusion, a beast will appear, beckoning them down deep below into the depths. And then once that beast combusts and erupts in fire, a bunch of messengers appear climbing over the hunter, and then they usher them into the hunter's dream. So messengers are called shisha in Japanese, which I believe I talked about yesterday in Smo's stream, or Smo's video, or maybe it was the day before that. And shisha in Japanese can be read or pronounced as dead person or messenger or envoy. And so I think messengers are literally the spirits of the dead that usher hunters to the nightmare realms or whatnot, and kind of exist in the blood. So if the Pthumerians have been imbibing this blood like we have, could they eventually become more like the messengers, the dead themselves? I think that's actually highly, highly likely, and I believe that is probably why the Pthumerian elders and Queen Yarnum all have these kind of faces which resemble those of messengers, if a little less grotesque. Yeah, the Labyrinth sages? Yeah. So no, these ones aren't sages, I don't think. The Sadako looking like dudes. Bloodborne Mad Man. Oh, Mad 1? No, that's the other dude. These dudes. We have a picture. Yeah, this guy. He also has like chainmail on, which is kind of fun. Scrambled eggs, welcome in. Messengers are little guys, small buddies, ghostly pals. Yeah. You've always assumed that Queen Yarnum was truly undying like a great one is said to be, but the rest of the Pthumerians were undying in the sense that they don't die of natural causes. TA compares them to sort of inverted cherubs in his new video, which is pretty compelling. Yeah, I've been saying that the messengers are spirits of the dead for years now, and I would agree that I think Queen Yarnum is a couple orders of magnitude above like the kinds of Pthumerians that we see down here, and she is probably more analogous to a great one, and these things aren't. And what I mean, the point about like them losing their reproductive rights, maybe not rights, abilities, is due to no longer being human by being superhuman to the point where they no longer need to evolve, which I think goes back into that one interview with Miyazaki, which Smoughtown cited in his last video, where he says, let's go ahead and pull it up. Society? Hold on. Nope. Birth. That'll probably do it. Okay. The interviewer says, this is meant partly as a joke, but that is baby Murgo, right? Or that baby is Murgo, right? Could you talk a little about Murgo? We thought it'd be better if Guinevere was the wet nurse instead. So Miyazaki says, whatever, lol. In the world of Bloodborne, babies that are treated as special in one way or the other are offered as lures to the Great Ones. The Great Ones have all lost their children because of their positions, and as a result, they're attracted to these special babies. The babies are one way of calling them. This story setup was something I came up with pretty readily in my mind. When it comes to living creatures, the stronger and more advanced you are, the fewer offspring you produce in your life. Even with human beings, the birth rates in more advanced countries are lower, right? Looking back, I wonder if facts like that were at the root of the idea. So, with Queen Yarnum being like the apex being of the Pthumerian civilization, it makes sense to me that even though she's able to have a child of blood, she can't give it a proper natural birth because it is even more inhuman than she, and so her body begins to reject her baby, which is why she kind of loses her child. So you could make the argument that she is a kind of great one because she even loses her child, but her child may still persist even on a level beyond Queen Yarnum herself because it's even more inhuman than she is. But of course, a lot of that is just very arguable and open to interpretation. It's all good. Okay, so that's a pretty good ending there. Let's go back into the video.
Expect a barbarian or tribal culture to wear. Likewise, the extreme difference in weight between the regular Watchers and the Merciless Watchers, to me, is an illustration of a clan structure. While we, in a modern society, have access to plentiful food, and will often see obesity as a negative, as a sign of excess.
So he's totally missing out on his HelloFresh sponsor right here again, unless he like makes a little quip.
In certain medieval cultures where food was finite, obesity was often seen as an indicator of wealth and position. I think in the case of the Watchers, the system is very clear. Might and physical strength is the only factor that matters when it comes to leadership. The merciless chieftains are the strongest among their clan, and thus are able to dominate their skinny kin, and in turn, they get the prime cuts of food by virtue of their position, getting stronger and bigger, and so the cycle continues. Alongside these Watchers, we have other primitive life forms that also seem to be the descendants of Pthumerians, that no doubt help make up these feral tribes. For example, we have the...
So, in a certain sense, I don't think Smoughtown is kind of wrong with his claims, although I do wonder whether or not they're applicable to Bloodborne quite the way he's presenting them, just because even in modern day Yarnum, we still kind of have this weird intermingling. I don't want to say like different species, but certainly people of different builds, because we have like the brick trolls, which are kind of analogous to the Merciless Watchers with their sizes being much, much larger than the normal Yarnumites. And to be fair, I think like the dissectors, the things that are called like executioners but aren't actually executioners, they may have also been brick trolls that just have a more active role in the church. And right, I don't necessarily agree with the whole clan thing just because like they're bigger, but I still do agree with the overall idea that there is definitely a hierarchy in Pthumeru based on the nature of them having a monarchy, if for no other reason.
twitching labyrinth madmen, that again have the features of a Pthumerian descendant, but as we can see from their behaviours, they are a far cry from that high Pthumerian culture. They are little more than feral beasts living in a cave. And in fact, they kind of remind me of the monsters in the film The Descent, which is a great horror film if you're into it. But the creatures in this film are heavily hinted to essentially just be humans who have lived underground for so long that they've become more feral, more bestial. And I see the same at play here with these labyrinth madmen. We can learn a little bit about what...
And again, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure they only appear in like the Lauren Chalice dungeons. Or at the least, maybe not the Pthumerian ones. I'm going to look them up just because it's kind of bothering me now. Wrong wiki. Okay. So where do they Pure, Ailing, Lauren, Lower, and the Hintertombs. Okay, so certainly not Ease, Eyes, or the actual Pthumerian ones. So that makes sense to me.
Culture from the Hintertomb Chalice, which reads the following. Hintertombs are the peripheral catacombs of the old underground labyrinth. To this day, the Watchers continue to expand the Hintertombs, unceremonious catacombs filled with graves and death. These Hintertombs are not the original halls created by the Pthumerians of old, rather they are newer tunnels, carved out on the peripheries of the labyrinth, as we discussed in the first part of this chapter. I find the term unceremonious catacombs to be very interesting. The impression given to me is that this tribe is the successor culture to those royal Pthumerians, still possessing the knowledge and ability to dig out new tunnels, but without the purpose or artistry of the original Pthumerians. This is a culture in decline, a culture who continue to do as their ancestors did, but without the regard for why they did it. That being said, there is evidence that these more simple Watchers, these degenerate descendants of the Pthumerians, are still being led by more pure Pthumerians, for lack of a better word. Pthumerian descendants still exist, and while these are Pthumerian descendants, we can see that their features more closely match the Pthumerian elders of old, as do their apparel. The finer red robes that are closer to the Pthumerian elders rather than the barbarian clothes of the Watcher descendants. And indeed we do find a Pthumerian elder in the lower Hintertomb Chalice dungeon. And to me it's not a stretch to believe that these more pure Pthumerians now hold a lot of sway over their distant Watcher kin, that these are warlords and leaders of this culture in decline, with the descendants and elders being some of the last of this ancient culture. We also have to consider the giants found in the labyrinth. Bob the Hollow in his video suggests that these too are a degenerate form of the once noble Pthumerians, a comparison that is hard to ignore when you look at the faces of the church giants and consider the likelihood that they were recruited by the church alongside their Pthumerian kin. Yet while the church giants are somewhat kept tame and normal and unmutilated, the forms of the giants we find in the dungeons are a far cry from this. Butchered and augmented and deformed after generations of living in these tunnels like beasts, it is difficult not to feel sorry for these giants, especially when you consider what's been done to their bodies. They are more or less weapon platforms, mutilated in various ways to make them deadlier. Limbs lobbed off in favour of blades, chains and weights nailed into their backs to make deadly sweeping attacks, and cannons replacing arms. We really are speculating a lot, but this speaks of a brutal culture to me, constantly involved in combat. What's my interpretation of these giants? These are Pthumerian descendants, brutalised by Watcher clans who are constantly engaging each other in barbaric tribal warfare. This isn't precise surgery. Some even have the cannons found in the ruins of Pthumeru's glory age, grafted onto their bodies as crude firearms.
So yeah, I don't know if I would agree with that in terms of like the Watchers fighting each other, because I'm pretty sure we don't really get too many instances of that, with the exceptions of like the random beast-possessed souls fighting like literally everything in the Chalice dungeons, I think, if you ever find any of them in one of the root ones. But it's also questionable how canonically accurate you want to believe root chalices to be. Obviously, we do get some actual legitimate lore out of the root chalices with the Ring of Betrothal specifically. You need to go into a root eel chalice or ihil, whatever you want to call it. So, I don't know. Since we're looking at the Chalice dungeons, do you think Loran and Pthumeru were distinct cultures of the same race, like Yharnam and Cainhurst, or completely separate civilizations instead? So are they Chozo, or are the Chozo also Pthumerians? Maybe. So I had mentioned it earlier in the stream. You most likely were not here, that I do kind of see Loran being like the equivalent of Yharnam to Pthumeru's Cainhurst. So pretty much kind of what you said right there. You don't think they figured out monster fighting in the DLC?
I do also wonder if the Eye Collectors and Witches of Hemwicks are inheritors of the Pthumerian Rite Keepers. While they clearly aren't pure Pthumerians, as their faces are quite different, it is hard to ignore the long-limbed similarity that they have to those Labyrinth Rite Keepers. Indeed, I would speculate that these witches try and continue the work of the Rite Keepers. They are mainly concerned with collecting eyes, as you may find out to your peril, and perhaps the reason they are permitted to exist in Yarhar Ghul and the village of Hemwick is because of their knowledge of the dungeons and their rites, and they are allowed to carry out their work under the auspices of the church or the School of Mensis. Incidentally, the Chapel Dweller also shares a very similar model to these witches. Perhaps he too is a descendant of the Pthumerians, however distant, continuing the worship of his god, just now on the surface. And if this is true, combined with the church giants, the church servants, and the witches, it seems that the surface and Yharnam is one of the greatest concentration of Pthumerian survivors. The regression of this culture is why it's easier to believe that Pthumerian descendants have been enslaved to serve the church, either as muscle by the healing church or as kidnappers by the more nefarious School of Mensis. While Yharnam the city is built upon the bones of this ancient civilization and is named after the last united Pthumerian queen, it is not exactly a legacy to be proud of. A collapsed empire, either enslaved by a lesser race now, or fighting like beasts in the depths of their once great empire. The barbarian Watcher chieftains are a far cry from the regality of the Pthumerian monarchy.
So I would kind of agree with that idea that if the monarchy kind of ascended, it most likely would have left the rest of the Pthumerians behind, and that might also help explain how Abritus is left behind, but of course that's a pretty big stretch there, and you could take that with a hefty grain of salt. So yeah, if the Pthumerians kind of left the mortal coil, what does that say about their servants? Maybe some followed them into death because we have like the Keepers of the Old Lords and the Watchdogs of the Old Lords, but we don't exactly know about the Watchers and whatnot. But alright, looks like we're towards the end of the video. I'm going to let him close out his thoughts, and then I'm going to try to remember something else that I've been saving for a minute.
Perhaps that regality was once found in the vile bloods of Cainhurst, who seem to have somewhat mimicked their regality and culture after finding the truth of vile blood. But now even Cainhurst Castle is little more than a mausoleum, no different than the remains of Pthumeru deep below the ground, both monuments to slaughter and shattered ambitions. But for all their failings, there is still something captivating and extraordinary about the Pthumerians, a kingdom born from humble origins to a high culture with deep knowledge of the Great Ones. They are the literal foundations of Bloodborne and its lore. After all, there is no Yharnam without the Pthumerians, and there is no Bloodborne without the Labyrinth. So thanks guys, that is my take on the superhuman Pthumerians, an interesting and complex race. I know there was a lot of speculation in this video, but I do believe there's a lot to be mined about the Pthumerians if you look a little closer at the environmental details rather than item descriptions. But let me know your thoughts on the Pthumerians in the comment below, if you think I missed anything, and what you'd like me to cover next. Again, I'd like to give a shout out to Loki for once again providing insights and translations, to Bob the Hollow for his excellent video on the Pthumerians and the Labyrinth, and to Last Protagonist for their seminal video on the Vile Bloods. And it would mean a great deal to me if you could go and support these creators. They will all be linked below. If you'd like to support the channel, then please give us a subscribe and a like, as I cover Soulsborne lore almost exclusively. If you'd like to support the channel in other ways, I do have a Patreon and channel memberships, as well as buy me a coffee for those who are looking to do one-off bits of support. But until next time guys, I will see you in the dusty corridors of the Pthumerian Labyrinth. Take care and have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed the video. I think it was really good, very grounded for the most part, and the parts where it wasn't grounded, I think were pretty well set up to be more of his speculation, which I always appreciate. So let's go ahead and link his video into the chat right now. So if you guys want to give him some of that support, you are more than welcome to do so. And right, going back briefly towards what he was saying at the end of the video, and even like throughout the video in terms of like the mortality of the Pthumerians and stuff, I do think one thing that's kind of important to consider in tandem with all that we learned about the Pthumerians and the nightmares and stuff is that consciousness can exist beyond the body, and we can see that come into effect with the nightmares. However, there are a couple other instances of consciousnesses existing beyond the bodies in Cainhurst, as well as a couple places in the Chalice dungeons themselves, with the spirits in Cainhurst kind of being beheaded, or, you know, they may have killed themselves to avoid being slaughtered by the healing church, and they still persist even after their deaths. And we don't know if that's a product of them just being like vengeful, angry spirits, or like maybe not angry, but just troubled spirits, emotionally distraught spirits, or whether or not that has some effect because of the blood, or if it came out because of some effect of the blood. It's definitely arguable there, but at the very least, we are shown that ghosts kind of can persist in the blood in things like the Logarius wheel and the Executioner's gloves, but those kind of ghosts do seem quite different from the spirits we find in Cainhurst Castle specifically. And setting those ones aside, we do have some of the random teleporting mad ghosts which can attack the player down there in the Chalice dungeons as well. And beyond them, we also have the examples of the non-hostile pilgrim dudes who wander around. They're very tall and very thin, and they almost have like a shepherd's crook when they waddle about. So let me look those up just to share that kind of image with you guys. Bloodborne pilgrim. These dudes, if you ever saw them, I think they're in 1 or 2 of the story dungeons, but they're really rare. So like these tall, thin guys. And then the Mad Labyrinth Spirit are these ladies with their kind of like ceremonial knives, which remind me of Yarnum's knife and their ability to teleport. When you hit all of these spectral beings, I don't remember the pilgrims though, they kind of emit the same sound as hitting like a wandering madness, and they bleed out that black mist instead of blood, which I do think is most likely tied to the nightmares. And I do talk about that a lot in one of my videos. I think it might be about the vile blood, or maybe it's like the origin of the blood. But I do think like the blood and the nightmares are intrinsically connected, and the nightmares are kind of like where the spirits of the dead go when they're no longer alive, because it's kind of like a purgatory of sorts, which I think is exemplified with the Hunter's Dream especially. So, right. If mortality is a product of being a great one, does that mean the vile bloods even of Cainhurst were great ones themselves? I think that's going a bit too far, so maybe I should have mentioned that a bit more in Smoughtown's video about the great ones, but I guess it just didn't really occur to me at the time, but it did now, so I bring it up. Alright. So Killer King says, in my opinion, what is the Moonside Lake? A layered dimension of the real world? A dream dimension? In the real world? Or is the real world even real? Does it even matter when dreams and nightmares are real enough? That's a very good question. I don't have extremely strong opinions about it, because if we're in the waking world and we hop down into the bath but get teleported into another dimension, that's kind of weird and a little bit hard to explain. But to be fair, when we do go to Yahar'gul, we can also step into baths there and get teleported directly. So it does seem to be a potential like magical property in the world of Bloodborne. And that idea might also just come into play with how messengers can like appear out of the ground with like this like black nightmarish puddle surrounding them and drag the hunter through it to transport them into the dream and potentially other hunters' worlds if you choose to help another one in jolly cooperation or hunt another one with a jolly uncooperation. I don't know. The Moonside Lake is on the moon, or at least the moon's reflection. Yeah, so it could be a reflection of the moon, which could be like a Buddhist allegory of like searching on the path of enlightenment, which I guess I never really thought about in this context before until now. So, yeah. All right. So we only have like 20 minutes left. I don't really know. Oh yeah, I guess I could show off like this super short 1-minute video by like Sekiro Doobie. Just to fill out a little bit of the time, or we could end a little bit early and pick things up again tomorrow. And just stay focused on Bloodborne for today and like leave the Elden Ring stuff together or something like that. Yeah, I think that's what we could do. I mean, I usually go over, so why not go under for once? So yeah, this was another good video by Smoughtown. I enjoyed it a lot. I also want to thank Smoughtown for all the kind shout-outs. You can ease up a little bit, but I appreciate it nonetheless. So for all of you who've joined me in for today's stream, thank you very much. Make sure to like and subscribe Smoughtown stuff as well as mine, I guess I should say. Since we have some people forgetting without horns. And we will be going live again tomorrow at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time if you want to come hang out before Armored Core gets released, or maybe after. I don't exactly remember the release time. But anyway, Armored Core tomorrow, folks. Look forward to that. That'll be it for me. You take care. Last Protagonist out.